Steve Jobs, Visionary Innovator. By Jamie Glick. Chapter 1. Early Years and Adoption, 1955 to 1968. There is a house on Crist Drive in Mountain View, California, that looks much like any other house on the street. Modest, suburban, quietly unremarkable from the outside. But inside that house, in the early years of the 1960s, a young boy was taking apart radios, pestering his father with questions that had no easy answers, and beginning to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. That boy was Steve Jobs. But before we find him in that house, we have to go back a little further. Back to the beginning of a story that, even in its very first chapter, carries the unmistakable mark of something extraordinary. It was February 24, 1955, when Stephen Paul Jobs came into the world in San Francisco, California. His birth parents were Joanne Stiebel, a young American woman of Swiss and German descent, and Abdel Fattah Jandali, a Syrian graduate student studying at the University of Wisconsin. They were unmarried, and in 1955, that fact carried enormous social weight. Joanne's father disapproved deeply of the relationship, and so, with a heaviness that only a parent forced by circumstance can truly know, Joanne made the decision to give her son up for adoption. She had one condition, one quiet, firm request that she held onto like a promise. She wanted her son to be adopted by college graduates. She wanted to know that the family who raised him would value education, would open books as naturally as they opened doors. As it happened, the couple first selected to adopt the baby boy backed out at the last moment. They had wanted a girl. And so, by the slimmest thread of chance, the kind of chance that history sometimes turns on, a working-class couple from San Francisco stepped forward instead. Their names were Paul and Clara Jobs. Paul was a machinist and a man who worked with his hands. Clara was a bookkeeper with a warm and steady presence. They were not college graduates. When Joanne Stiebel learned this, she hesitated. She held back her signature. But Paul and Clara made her a promise, a sincere, heartfelt promise, that their son would go to college, that they would see to it. And with that promise, Stephen Paul Jobs had a home. Paul and Clara Jobs named their new son Stephen, and from the very first days, they loved him completely and without condition. Steve would later speak about this with a clarity and warmth that left no room for doubt. "My parents were my parents 1000%, he would say. There was no asterisk on that love. No footnote. It was simply his family." The young family moved to Mountain View, in the heart of what was then still orchards and open land, though engineers and dreamers were already beginning to gather there, drawn by the quiet revolution taking root in the valley's electronics industry. This place would one day be called Silicon Valley. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was still becoming itself, much like the small boy growing up on Crist Drive. Paul Jobs was a man of remarkable craft and patience. He had a workshop in the garage, and it was here, in the smell of sawdust and motor oil, under the pale overhead light, that some of Steve's most formative education took place. Paul would restore old cars, tinker with machinery, and he taught his son something that no classroom could quite replicate, that the things inside objects matter just as much as the things on the outside. That craftsmanship is not just about what people can see. It is about integrity. About doing something properly even when no one is looking. There is a story Steve Jobs told many times because it stayed with him his entire life. His father was building a fence and he insisted on painting the back of it, the side that would face the wall, the side no neighbor would ever see, just as carefully as the front. A young Steve asked him why. And Paul Jobs said simply, "You'll know. That idea, that unseen quality matters, that a craftsman's pride lives in the hidden details, would one day define everything Steve Jobs made." From a young age, it became clear that Stephen was not a child who sat quietly. He was curious in a way that could exhaust the patience of the unprepared. He took things apart. He wanted to know how they worked, what lived inside them, what made them do what they did. His mother Clara taught him to read before he even started school, and he arrived at Monte Loma Elementary with a mind already hungry and restless. School, as it turned out, was not immediately a comfortable fit. Steve was bright, almost obviously so, but brightness without direction can sometimes look like mischief, and young Steve had plenty of both. He and a small group of friends developed what might generously be called a talent for creative disruption. There were pranks. There were schemes. There was the time he and a friend put a notice in the school suggesting that students should bring their pets to class, and they did. There was the small matter of an explosive device let off under a teacher's chair. His third-grade teacher, a woman named Imogene Hill, who the students called Teddy, eventually made Steve a straightforward offer. She would pay him in cash and candy if he completed his workbooks and behaved. It worked. Remarkably, it worked. By the end of that year, Steve had tested so far above grade level that the school wanted to move him ahead. Not 1 year but 2. His parents agreed to 1. And so Steve skipped 4th grade, entering 5th with a new sense of possibility and a teacher who had, in her own pragmatic way, taught him something important. That the right incentive, presented with honesty and respect, could move mountains. It was around this time that the geography of Steve's world expanded in a critical direction. The Jobs family had moved to a new home on Evelyn Avenue in Sunnyvale, and here, in a neighborhood quietly teeming with engineers who had come to work for companies like Hewlett-Packard and Lockheed, Steve encountered a world he had not yet imagined. The man next door was an engineer at HP. He showed Steve a carbon microphone. He showed him a transistor radio. He brought home strange and beautiful pieces of technology and walked this curious, wide-eyed boy through their logic, their elegance, their function. Steve was mesmerized. Later he would describe the neighborhood as a place where you could wander into a garage and a grown man would take time to explain to you exactly how something worked. Not because he had to, but because that is the kind of culture it was. Ideas were meant to be shared. Curiosity was not an inconvenience. It was the whole point. This was the ecosystem that shaped Steve Jobs. Not a single school, not a single teacher, but an entire community of people who believed that the future was something you built with your hands and your mind. When Steve was around 10 or 11 years old, he had an encounter with a piece of equipment that would prove quietly pivotal. Through a program affiliated with Hewlett-Packard, he came across one of the early desktop computers. A machine called the HP 9100A. It was enormous by modern standards. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. But to Steve, looking at it for the first time, it was something close to magic. He wanted one. He called the number of a man he had been told was the right person to ask. And he called him directly, without embarrassment or hesitation, simply because he wanted the part. That man was Bill Hewlett. Bill Hewlett answered the phone himself, spoke to Steve for 20 minutes, and was so charmed by the boy's directness and enthusiasm that he not only gave him the parts he needed but offered him a summer job on the HP assembly line. Steve Jobs was 12 years old. It is the kind of story that, in retrospect, seems almost too perfect. But it happened. And it tells us something important, not just about Steve's fearlessness but about the world he was growing up in. A world where a 12-year-old boy could call a company founder and be taken seriously. A world where curiosity, if it was bold enough, opened real doors. But it was not only technology that was forming the mind and heart of the young Steve Jobs. Music moved him deeply, particularly the music of the 1960s, which was, in its own way, as revolutionary as any circuit board. Bob Dylan above all. Dylan's refusal to be categorized, his insistence on following his own internal compass regardless of what anyone expected, would become a kind of North Star for Steve in the years to come. The Beatles too. The idea of a group of people, a small group of deeply creative, deeply committed people, who could change the culture of an entire world. That idea lodged itself somewhere inside him and did not let go. He was also reading. Voraciously, eclectically, in the way of a mind that does not yet know what it is looking for but will recognize it when it arrives. Science, history, philosophy. The great questions of how things came to be and what they were for. By 1968, Steve Jobs was 13 years old. He was living in Sunnyvale, attending Crittenden Middle School, a school he reportedly found rough and uninspiring, and whose social landscape he navigated with something less than ease. He was wiry, intense, already developing the combination of charm and stubbornness that would define him. He was the kind of boy who, when he decided something mattered, decided it completely, and when he decided it did not, could not be made to pretend otherwise. His parents, for their part, continued to nurture him with a kind of steady, uncomplicated devotion. Paul still worked in the garage, still taught his son to see beauty in the hidden details of craftsmanship. Clara read with him, talked with him, kept the warmth of home as a constant in a childhood that was already pulling in extraordinary directions. There is something worth pausing on, here at the end of this early chapter of Steve's life. He was adopted. He was raised by a man who never finished high school and a woman who worked as a bookkeeper. He grew up in a modest house in a suburban neighborhood. Nothing about his origins would have suggested the magnitude of what was coming. And yet, in every detail of those early years you can see it. The curiosity, the craftsman's eye, the refusal to accept that things cannot be better than they are, the absolute willingness to pick up the phone and ask. He was not yet the man who would change the world. But he was unmistakably becoming him. The years ahead would bring high school, and then a brief and unconventional college experience, and then a garage in Los Altos where two young men would sit together and dare to dream of something the world had never quite seen before. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, we leave Stephen Jobs at 13, restless, brilliant, and already leaning forward into the future. Chapter 2. Teenage Influences and Rebellion, 1968 to 1972. There is a particular kind of energy that lives in a teenager who has already begun to sense, however dimly, that the world is larger than the one immediately in front of him. It is not always comfortable energy. It does not always sit well in classrooms or follow the expected social scripts. It can look, from the outside, like restlessness, like difficulty, like rebellion. In Steve Jobs, that energy was present from the moment he entered his teenage years, and it was about to find exactly the right fuel. By 1968, the world itself was on fire with change. It was a year of assassinations and protests, of moonshots and marches. The Vietnam War was tearing at the fabric of American life. On college campuses and city streets, young people were raising their voices, questioning authority, refusing to accept the world as handed down to them. The counterculture was not a fringe movement anymore, it was a roar, and it was getting louder. Steve Jobs heard that roar. And it resonated with something already alive inside him. He was 13 years old, living in Sunnyvale and about to enter Homestead High School, a school that sat, almost symbolically, right in the heart of Silicon Valley. Down one road were the engineers and the circuit boards and the clean logic of technology. Down another were the musicians, the poets, the questioners, the dreamers who were pulling at the seams of convention and asking what lay on the other side. Steve did not choose between those two roads. He walked both of them, often simultaneously, and it was precisely that double inheritance, the technical and the humanistic, the precise and the poetic, that would one day make him unlike anyone else in any room he ever entered. Let us talk first about music, because music was not background noise in Steve Jobs' teenage years. It was something closer to a religion. Bob Dylan, above all others, occupied a special place. Steve had begun listening to Dylan in his early teens, and by the time he reached high school, that listening had deepened into something more like study. Dylan's lyrics, dense, literary, defiant, shot through with imagery that felt borrowed from another century while speaking entirely to this one, seemed to Steve like proof that art could be both beautiful and true at the same time. That you did not have to choose between depth and accessibility. That a song could be a poem, and a poem could be a protest, and a protest could be a work of genius. Dylan's refusal to be pinned down also spoke to something in Steve's own nature. Dylan had been folk music's golden boy, and then he picked up an electric guitar and walked away from that identity without apology or explanation. He simply followed where his instincts led, regardless of what the audience wanted or what the critics demanded. That kind of artistic courage, the willingness to trust your own vision over the approval of the crowd, was something Steve Jobs would carry with him for the rest of his life. The Beatles were the other great love. And where Dylan offered the lone poet's integrity, the Beatles offered something different. The idea of a small group of wildly talented, deeply committed individuals who, together, could create something none of them could have created alone. Something that did not just entertain people, something that genuinely moved the culture forward. Listening to the arc of their work, from the early joyful 3-minute singles to the vast, layered ambition of their later albums, Steve absorbed a lesson about creative evolution, about refusing to repeat yourself, about the courage to grow. He would talk about the Beatles throughout his entire life. Decades later, when describing what he hoped Apple could be, he would reach for their example almost instinctively. High school arrived, and with it came the full complexity of adolescence. The social hierarchies, the identity experiments, the longing to belong, and the simultaneous need to stand apart. Steve entered Homestead High School in the fall of 1968, and his experience there was, by most accounts, a complicated one. He was intellectually far ahead of most of his peers in certain ways, but academically inconsistent, passionately engaged with the subjects that interested him and fundamentally indifferent to those that did not. He was not, by the social standards of a 1960s California high school, an obvious fit. He was intense. He was opinionated. He had a quality that some found magnetic and others found abrasive, a directness that did not soften itself for the sake of comfort. He did not play sports in any serious way. He was not part of the mainstream social world of jocks and cheerleaders. He existed in a slightly different register, drawn to the students who were curious and unconventional, who spent their lunch hours talking about ideas rather than games, who felt the pull of the counterculture and were beginning to experiment with what a different kind of life might look like. And it was in this world, this in-between world of electronics and experimentation, of technology and philosophy, of California sunshine and countercultural questioning, that Steve Jobs found his people. The most important of these people in the years immediately ahead was a boy 4 years his senior named Bill Fernandez. Bill was a neighbor, a gentle and thoughtful young man with an interest in electronics who would serve, in the grand story of Steve Jobs, as a crucial connector. It was Bill who first introduced Steve to a figure who would alter the entire direction of his life. His name was Stephen Wozniak. Everyone called him Woz. Steve Jobs met was around 1969, when Steve was 14 and Woz was 18. The introduction happened simply enough. Bill Fernandez thought the two of them might get along, might share enough interest to make a friendship worth trying. He was right. Almost immediately, something clicked. Woz was unlike anyone Steve had met before. He was a technical genius of a rare and almost otherworldly kind. A boy who seemed to think in circuits the way other people thought in words, who could look at a piece of electronics and understand it the way a musician understands a chord. He was also funny. Genuinely, warmly, effortlessly funny, a prankster with a gift for absurdist humor that could make you laugh until your sides ached. Steve was not Woz's equal in raw technical skill, and he knew it. But Steve had something Woz did not, something that was equally important and perhaps even rarer. He could see. He could look at what Woz was building and understand not just what it was, but what it could mean, what it could become, who would want it and why and how it should be presented to the world so that the world would understand its value. They were, in the most fundamental sense, complementary. Two halves of a conversation that the future was waiting to have. For now, though, they were just two young men in California sharing a passion for electronics, for pranks, for music, for the particular joy of understanding how things worked and the even greater joy of making things that had never existed before. The counterculture was deepening its hold on Steve's imagination as he moved through his high school years, and it was doing so in ways that went well beyond music. This was the era of the Whole Earth Catalog, a remarkable publication that Steve would later describe as one of the most influential things he ever encountered. The catalog was the creation of Stuart Brand, and it was, in essence, a curated collection of tools and ideas for a generation that wanted to build something new. It was part shopping guide, part philosophy text, part love letter to human ingenuity. It celebrated the handmade and the homemade. It valued knowledge for its own sake. It suggested that the right tools, in the right hands, could help ordinary people create extraordinary things. The last issue of the Whole Earth Catalog, published when Steve was in his late teens, carried on its back cover a photograph of a country road in the early morning light and the words, "Stay hungry. Stay foolish." Those 4 words became something like a personal creed for Steve Jobs. He would carry them for decades, and when he stood before the graduating class of Stanford University in 2005, in what many consider the finest speech of his life, he returned to them, offered them as his farewell gift to young people standing at the beginning of their own stories. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. But in the early 1970s, that was still far ahead. Right now, Steve was a teenager absorbing everything, the music, the philosophy, the technology, the questions, and beginning, slowly, to synthesize it into something that was entirely his own. It would be incomplete to tell this chapter of Steve's story without acknowledging that these years also brought a genuine darkness, or at least a genuine difficulty. Steve was not an easy person to know. He was, by the accounts of those around him, capable of extraordinary warmth and equally capable of a bluntness that could wound. He was forming habits of intensity and single-mindedness that would serve him magnificently in some contexts and make him genuinely hard to be around in others. He was also beginning to explore the wider landscape of the counterculture in ways that were not without risk. This was, after all, the era of widespread experimentation, with ideas, with substances, with ways of living that rejected the assumptions of the generation before. Steve was not immune to any of this. He would later speak openly about his use of LSD in these years, describing it as one of the most important experiences of his life, not in a reckless way but in a reflective one. He said that it deepened his sense of the world's complexity, reinforced his conviction that there were layers to reality that most people never paused to look for, and strengthened his belief that creativity required a willingness to look beyond the obvious. He was also reading widely and eclectically: Shakespeare, Plato, the writings of Eastern philosophy, the American Romantics. He had a particular attraction to Zen Buddhism, which offered a clarity and a discipline that appealed to the same part of him that loved the clean lines of a well-designed circuit. The idea that the most profound truths were often the simplest ones. That stripping away the unnecessary was itself a form of wisdom. These were not idle intellectual hobbies. They were foundations. Every book he read, every idea he absorbed, every piece of music he listened to in those years was being quietly assembled into the worldview of a man who would one day insist, with absolute conviction, that technology and the liberal arts were not separate things, that the most powerful inventions lived at the intersection of the two. In school, one teacher cut through Steve's restlessness and resistance in a way that few others managed. Her name was not recorded in the great histories, but the experience of being genuinely taught, of having someone believe in his capacity for rigor and discipline when that belief was not the obvious or easy thing, left its mark on him. More broadly, what Steve was learning in these years was not primarily happening in classrooms. It was happening in garages, in late-night conversations, in the pages of books he chose for himself, in the music that seemed to say what ordinary language could not. He was learning to trust his instincts. Learning that the things he found beautiful were worth taking seriously. Learning that the distance between a good idea and a bad one was often just the courage to ask the next question. By the time Steve Jobs was nearing the end of his years at Homestead High School, he was already, in many important ways, formed. Not finished. No one is finished at 17, but formed. The essential shape of the person he would become was already visible to anyone paying close attention. He was someone who cared, with an almost uncomfortable passion, about the quality of things. About doing work that was genuinely good rather than merely adequate. He was someone who did not accept that technical and artistic excellence were in tension, who believed in his bones that a thing could be both beautifully made and brilliantly functional. He was someone who had no patience for the limitations that other people accepted as permanent. And he was someone who, having spent these years in the unique crucible of Silicon Valley, surrounded by engineers and entrepreneurs, by folk musicians and countercultural philosophers, by the whole Earth catalog and the music of Dylan and the Beatles, had absorbed something that very few people in the world possessed. The sense that technology, wielded with intention and beauty, could be a tool for human liberation. That was not a small idea. That was, in the fullest sense, a vision. Paul and Clara Jobs watched their son grow through these turbulent, formative years with a love that held steady through every squall. They did not always understand him. They did not always know quite what to make of his intensities or his convictions. But they had promised, back in the beginning, to give him every opportunity they could, and that promise they kept without wavering. In 1972, Steve Jobs graduated from Homestead High School. He was 17 years old. He was about to leave home for the first time, heading to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, a small, fiercely intellectual liberal arts school that had caught his imagination for reasons he could not fully articulate. He would not last long there in any conventional sense. But what would happen next was anything but conventional. The teenager had become a young man. The young man was about to step out into the world, uncertain, restless, already burning with questions that had no easy answers. The garage, the orchard, the notebook of circuit diagrams, all of it was behind him now. What lay ahead was wider than anything he had yet imagined. Chapter 3. College Dropout and Spiritual Quest, 1972 to 1975. There is a particular kind of courage, or perhaps it is a particular kind of faith, that allows a person to step off the expected path and into the unknown without a map. Most of us, when we reach the edge of what is familiar, pull back. We return to the road that others have traveled before us, because the road at least has signs, and the signs at least promise a destination. Steve Jobs, at 17 years old, did not pull back. What he did instead, in the years between 1972 and 1975, was something that looked, from the outside, like chaos, like failure. Like a young man squandering his chances and wandering without purpose through a world that had better things to offer him if only he would sit still long enough to receive them. From the inside, it was something else entirely. It was an education. Perhaps the most important education of his life. Reed College, in Portland, Oregon, was not the obvious choice for a working-class kid from Sunnyvale whose father had never finished high school. It was small, fiercely intellectual, radically unconventional, and extraordinarily expensive. It attracted a certain kind of student, curious, restless, uninterested in the purely vocational, drawn to ideas for the sheer love of ideas. It had a reputation for academic rigor wrapped in countercultural freedom, a place where you might spend a Tuesday afternoon in a seminar on medieval philosophy and a Tuesday evening at a concert that shook the walls. Steve had fixated on Reed without being entirely able to explain why. Something about it called to him, the intellectual seriousness, perhaps, or the sense that it was a place where unconventional minds were genuinely welcome. His parents, honoring the promise they had made before he was even theirs, agreed to send him. Cost them nearly everything they had. Paul and Clara Jobs were not wealthy people. This sacrifice was real and Steve knew it. Which makes what happened next all the more complicated to tell. 6 months after arriving at Reed College, Steve Jobs dropped out. Not quietly and not entirely, but he stopped attending the classes he was formally enrolled in and withdrew from the official program. The reasons he gave, when he looked back on this decision years later, were thoughtful and carefully considered. He had watched his parents spend money they could not really afford on a college education that he was not certain he wanted. He did not know what he wanted to do with his life. He did not understand how the classes he was required to take were going to help him find out. And sitting in those required classes, going through the motions of an education he had not chosen, felt dishonest in a way he could not quite tolerate. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, he would say later, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. So he stopped. He told the college he was leaving the formal program. And then, and this is the part that reveals everything about who Steve Jobs was, he stayed. He stayed at Reed for another 18 months, sleeping on floors, eating for free at the Hare Krishna temple down the road, collecting and returning Coca-Cola bottles for the 5-cent deposits so he could afford food. He was, by any material measure, broke. He had given up his dormitory room. He had no safety net beyond the goodwill of friends who let him sleep on their floors and the free meals he could scrounge. And yet he was, by his own account, profoundly free. Free from the obligation to study what others had decided he should study. Free to wander through the college's course offerings and attend only the classes that genuinely called to him. Free to follow his curiosity wherever it led, without the pressure of grades or requirements or the expectations of a formal degree. He was, in other words, doing exactly what the Whole Earth catalog had suggested a person could do, building his own education from the raw materials of his own interest. One of the classes he wandered into, on something close to a whim, would end up shaping the visual language of personal computing for decades to come. It was a calligraphy class. Reed College had, at the time, some of the most beautiful calligraphy in the world adorning its posters and flyers and printed materials. Steve noticed it. He was drawn to it. And so he sat down in a calligraphy class and began to learn about serif and sans serif typefaces, about the spacing between letters, about the way a well-designed letter on a page has a weight and a rhythm that a poorly designed one does not. He learned that typography was not decoration. It was meaning. It was the shape that thought took when it became visible. He had no idea in the moment why any of this mattered. There was no practical application visible to him. He was simply following his eye, his instinct, his sense that beauty was worth understanding for its own sake. 10 years later, when he was designing the first Macintosh computer, every one of those lessons came flooding back. The Mac was the first personal computer to offer multiple beautiful typefaces. It was the first to treat the visual presentation of text as something worthy of genuine artistic attention. The entire typographic richness of the personal computer world, which we now take entirely for granted, which lives in every document and email and website in the world, traces its origin, in a direct and unbroken line, to a young man sitting in a calligraphy class at Reed College because he thought it looked interesting. Steve Jobs would tell this story many times and always with the same point. You cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. You have to trust that the things that call to you have a reason for calling, even when that reason is invisible. You have to trust that the dots will connect eventually. It was, perhaps, the deepest lesson of his entire life. But calligraphy was only one thread of an education that was rapidly becoming spiritual as much as intellectual. Reed College in the early 1970s was saturated with Eastern philosophy, with Zen Buddhism, with Hinduism, with the writings of people who had traveled to India and come back with a different sense of what life was for and how it ought to be lived. Steve was already drawn in this direction. His earlier reading had introduced him to ideas that the American mainstream had not yet fully absorbed. The idea that the mind could be trained, that perception was not fixed, that the self was not the rigid, unchanging thing that Western culture often assumed it to be. At Reed, these ideas were everywhere. And one book, above all others, became a kind of sacred text for the young Steve Jobs. It was called Autobiography of a Yogi, written by the Indian spiritual teacher Paramahansa Yogananda. It was a book about the journey of a soul, about the search for truth beyond the ordinary surfaces of things, about the encounters with mystics and masters, about the discipline and the grace and the occasional wild miracle of a life lived in genuine spiritual seeking. Steve read it first as a teenager. He would go on to read it once a year for the rest of his life. When he died, it was reportedly the only book on his iPad. What drew him to it? Partly the sheer strangeness and beauty of the world it described. Partly the seriousness of its inquiry, the sense that the biggest questions deserved the deepest attention. And partly, perhaps, because it spoke to something he recognized in himself, the conviction that reality was richer and stranger and more layered than the version of it that most people were content to accept. The spiritual current that ran through Reed's countercultural world was, by 1972 and 1973, converging with a broader cultural moment that was pulling many young Americans toward India, toward ashrams, toward the ancient traditions of the East. Steve felt that pull strongly. He had a friend at Reed, a young man named Daniel Kotke, who shared his interests and his restlessness. The two of them talked endlessly about Zen, about meditation, about the writings of figures like Ram Dass, whose book Be Here Now had become a kind of Bible for the spiritually searching generation of the early 1970s. They were not casual conversations, they were the conversations of young people genuinely trying to figure out how to live, what to believe, what a life well lived actually looked like. Zen Buddhism in particular took deep root in Steve. The Zen aesthetic, the reverence for simplicity, for the perfectly made object, for the line that contains no unnecessary element, for the silence that is as meaningful as the sound, spoke directly to the part of him that had learned, in his father's garage, that the back of the fence must be painted just as carefully as the front. Zen and craftsmanship were, he came to feel, expressions of the same truth, that precision and beauty were not opposites of depth, but its fullest expression. The Zen influence would never leave him. It would show up decades later in the products he made, in the clean lines of the iMac, in the silence of a white Apple store, in the single button on the first iPhone. The minimalism that the world eventually came to associate with Apple was not merely a design trend. It was a philosophy. And that philosophy had its roots, in no small part, in the hours a young Steve Jobs spent at Reed College sitting with Eastern ideas and finding in them something that felt like home. In the summer of 1974, Steve Jobs did something that very few young Americans were doing at the time, and that even within the countercultural world of the early 1970s required a particular kind of commitment. He went to India. He had decided, with the seriousness that characterized everything he truly cared about, that he wanted to seek out a spiritual teacher. He wanted to sit at the feet of someone who genuinely knew something, not about circuits or calligraphy or business, but about the nature of the mind, the nature of consciousness, the nature of what it meant to be alive. He traveled with Daniel Kotke, and the India they encountered was nothing like the romantic vision that had drawn them there. It was hot, and it was hard, and it was beautiful in a way that was entirely indifferent to their comfort. Steve fell ill. The roads were difficult. The ashram they had hoped to reach, the home of the teacher Neem Karoli Baba, who had been a figure of enormous significance for a generation of Western spiritual seekers, had effectively closed. Neem Karoli Baba had died the previous year in 1973, and the community that had gathered around him was dispersing. Steve was disappointed. But he did not come home empty-handed. India gave him things that could not be put on a syllabus. It gave him a first-hand encounter with a world organized around entirely different assumptions than the ones he had grown up with. A world where material simplicity was not poverty but choice. Where the interior life was considered more worthy of cultivation than the exterior one. Where time moved differently and patience was not a virtue so much as a basic orientation toward existence. It also gave him a renewed conviction about intuition. The Indian traditions he encountered and the teachers he spent time with spoke constantly about the power of direct experience, about the difference between knowing something intellectually and knowing it in your bones. Steve came back from India with a deeper trust in his own instincts, a deeper belief that the mind, properly cultivated, could perceive things that no amount of rational analysis would ever reach. He came home thinner, with a shaved head, wearing Indian clothing, deeply marked by what he had seen and felt. His parents barely recognized him at the airport. He returned to California in late 1974 and found himself, in early 1975, in an interesting position. He was 20 years old. He had no degree. He had some money from a brief stint working at Atari, a video game company that had hired him on the strength of his technical knowledge and his absolute refusal to take no for an answer, and whose founder, Nolan Bushnell, had seen something in this strange, intense young man worth betting on. Atari had been an education of its own kind. Steve had worked there before going to India, in a night shift arrangement made partly because his colleagues found him difficult to be around during the day, a blunt assessment that Steve himself later acknowledged with something between amusement and regret. He had worked alongside engineers and designers who were doing something genuinely new, making games that people wanted to play, wrestling with the question of how to make technology feel not just functional but fun. He had gone to India. He had meditated. He had sat with ancient questions. And now he was back. He was about to walk back into a garage. Not his father's garage this time, though the spirit of his father's garage was very much with him. He was about to walk back into the world of circuits and possibilities. He was about to find his old friend was again. Looking back at these years, the dropped-out months at Reed, the calligraphy class, the Eastern philosophy, the floors he slept on, the Coca-Cola bottles, the journey to India, the return, it would be a mistake to see them as a detour. They were not time lost. They were, in the deepest sense, time found. Every great creator needs two things: skill and vision. The skill tells you how to make things. The vision tells you what to make and why it matters, and what it should feel like in the hands of the person who holds it. Skill can be taught in conventional ways. Vision almost never can. Steve Jobs spent these years building his vision. Building the interior architecture of a mind that would one day insist, in the face of every pressure to do otherwise, that technology had to be beautiful, that it had to be intuitive, that it had to respect the person using it, that it had to carry within it a sense of what human life was for. Those convictions did not come from engineering classes. They came from a calligraphy class taken on a whim, from a book read once a year for a lifetime, from the roads of India and the floors of Reed College and the music of Bob Dylan and the quiet wisdom of a father who painted the back of a fence. They came, in short, from the years that looked like wandering, but were all along the most direct path. He was 20 years old. He had nothing and he had everything. In a garage in Cupertino, something was about to begin. The quest had prepared him. Now came the work. Chapter 4. Founding Apple with Wozniak, 1975 to 1977. There is a moment, in the life of every great endeavor, before anyone knows it is a great endeavor. A moment when the thing that will one day change everything is still just an idea in a room, still just two people talking, still just a sketch on a piece of paper or a circuit board on a workbench. A moment before the world has any opinion about it at all. For Apple, that moment happened in a garage. Not metaphorically. Not as a romantic simplification of a more complicated truth. An actual garage attached to an actual house on Chris Drive in Los Altos, California, belonging to Paul and Clara Jobs, the same steady, loving people who had painted the back of the fence and kept every promise they had made. Their son had come home. And in their garage, something was quietly beginning that would alter the course of human history. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Because before the garage there was a club. And before the club there was a computer. And before the computer there was Woz. Steve Jobs had returned from India in late 1974, thinner, shaved, marked by his journey, carrying within him the layered education of Reed College and the open roads of the subcontinent. He had gone back briefly to Atari, earning money and observing, with his characteristic sharpness, the way a company worked, the engineering culture, the design decisions, the gap between what a product was and what it could be. And he had reconnected with Stephen Wozniak. Woz, meanwhile, had been doing what Woz did best, building things. Extraordinary things. He had been working at Hewlett-Packard, doing solid and respectable engineering work, but his real creative life was happening after hours, in the way that the most important work of that era so often did. He was part of a loose, enthusiastic community of electronics hobbyists who gathered regularly in a Menlo Park community room under a name that captured perfectly the spirit of what they were doing. They called themselves the Homebrew Computer Club. The Homebrew Computer Club is one of those institutions that, in retrospect, seems almost impossibly significant for something so informal. It met for the first time in March of 1975, in the garage of one of its founders, with about 30 people in attendance. Within a year it would grow to hundreds. And the people who passed through its doors, sharing schematics, arguing about architectures, trading parts and ideas with the communal generosity of people who believe they are building a new world, would go on to shape the personal computer industry in ways that are still being felt today. The catalyst for its founding was a machine, or rather, the idea of a machine. The January 1975 issue of Popular Electronics magazine had featured on its cover a small, boxy device called the Altair 8800. It was a kit computer, you built it yourself from parts, and by the standards of what a computer had previously meant, it was almost laughably limited. It had no keyboard. It had no screen. You communicated with it by flipping switches and reading blinking lights. It could do very little that any ordinary person would find useful. And yet it caused a sensation. Because what the Altair represented, what made the members of the Homebrew Computer Club practically vibrate with excitement when they saw that magazine cover, was not what it was. It was what it meant. It meant that a computer, previously the exclusive property of universities and corporations and government agencies, could be small enough to sit on a desk. Could be owned by a private individual. Could be, in the most radical sense of the word, personal. The personal computer was not yet real. But it had become imaginable. And in that gap between real and imaginable, the Homebrew Computer Club set up shop and started building. Was attended the first homebrew meeting and came home, by his own account, so excited he could barely sleep. He had been thinking about personal computers already, thinking in the way that was thought, which was to say with a technical depth and elegance that most engineers could only admire from a distance. But the meeting crystallized something. It showed him a community of people who shared his passion, and it gave him a specific challenge to rise to. He went home and began designing. What was created over the following months was, by any measure, a work of genius. He designed a computer, genuinely designed it from the ground up, that was simpler, more elegant, and more powerful than anything else being built in that world. Where other designers used multiple chips to accomplish tasks, was found ways to do the same work with fewer, cleaner, more efficient solutions. His circuits had a beauty to them that other engineers recognized immediately, the beauty of a problem solved not just adequately but perfectly. He called it the Apple I. The name Apple had come from Steve, a memory, some said, of a happy summer spent working in an orchard, or perhaps simply an instinct that the name was friendly and approachable and human in a way that the technical names other companies favored were not. Whatever its origin, it was a choice that spoke to something essential about what Steve believed a computer company could be. Not cold, not intimidating, not the exclusive property of experts, but warm, accessible, and welcoming to everyone. Woz had designed the machine. But it was Steve who looked at it and saw a product. This distinction, between a machine and a product, is worth pausing on, because it is at the very heart of what made Steve Jobs extraordinary and what made the partnership between him and Woz so consequential. Woz was not thinking about selling the Apple I. His instinct, entirely consistent with the generous, collaborative spirit of the Homebrew Computer Club, was to share it, to present the schematics at the next meeting so that anyone who wanted to could build one for themselves. That was how the club worked. That was the culture. Knowledge was a gift to be passed around, not a commodity to be sold. Steve had enormous respect for that culture. He understood it. He had lived in it. But he saw something else, something that Woz, in his technical focus, was not looking for. He saw that there were people, many people, who wanted the thing that Woz had made but who could not build it themselves. Who did not have Woz's knowledge or Woz's patience or Woz's love of the process. People who wanted the destination without the journey. Those people needed someone to build it for them. And if someone was going to build it for them, that someone should be paid. Steve began to talk to Woz about selling the Apple I as a finished circuit board. Not a complete computer, not yet, but a board that an enthusiast could buy and assemble into a working machine without having to source every component themselves. The price would be modest. The ambition at this stage was modest too. Steve thought they might sell 100 of them. Woz was not immediately convinced that any of this was necessary. He had a good job at HP. He was comfortable. He was doing what he loved. Why complicate it? Steve could be very persuasive when he believed in something. And he believed in this. There was one other person whose perspective mattered enormously at this juncture, and his name was Mike Markkula. But before we get to Markkula, we need to talk about the moment the company was actually born, because it happened with a directness and simplicity that is almost startling when you consider what it eventually became. On April 1, 1976, April Fool's Day, a date that Steve apparently chose with some awareness of its comic potential, Steve Jobs, Stephen Wozniak, and a third partner named Ronald Wayne signed the documents that officially created the Apple Computer Company. Wayne was an older, more experienced hand who had worked with Steve at Atari. He drew the first Apple logo, an elaborate illustration of Isaac Newton sitting beneath an apple tree, and drafted the partnership agreement in careful legal language. His share of the company was 10%. A few weeks later, spooked by the financial risk and the sheer velocity of what Steve Jobs was setting in motion, Ronald Wayne sold his share back for $800. It was one of the most expensive decisions in the history of business. That 10% stake, had he kept it, would eventually be worth tens of billions of dollars. But that is the nature of moments before anyone knows what they are. The first significant sale came quickly. A local computer store called the Byte Shop, owned by a man named Paul Terrell, agreed to buy 50 assembled Apple I boards at $500 each. $25,000. For Steve and Woz, working out of a garage with parts bought on credit and assembled on a dining room table, it was both a windfall and a challenge of staggering proportions. They had 30 days to deliver 50 working computers. What followed was a controlled frenzy. Steve's sister Patty, friends, whoever could be pressed into service sitting at that dining room table, carefully assembling circuit boards. Paul Jobs, who had once taught his son that the unseen details of a fence mattered, now found his garage transformed into a production floor. Clara kept the household running around the edges of the chaos. They delivered. The Apple I found its customers, not many of them, not yet, but enough to prove the concept. Enough to show that there was a real market for this thing. Enough to make the next conversation possible. That next conversation happened when Steve Jobs met Mike Markkula. Markkula was 33 years old, already retired, and already wealthy from his time at Intel. He was thoughtful, measured, and possessed of a sharp instinct for business that complemented Steve's instinct for product in ways that would prove decisive. A mutual acquaintance had connected them, and Steve had done what Steve always did, pursued the meeting with complete focus and talked about his vision with the kind of absolute conviction that either inspired or alarmed everyone who encountered it. Markkula was inspired. He agreed to invest $250,000 of his own money into Apple Computer. He agreed to help the young company secure a line of bank credit. He became, in effect, the third co-founder, bringing the business knowledge and the financial credibility that Steve and Woz, for all their genius, simply did not yet have. But Markkula brought something else too, something that proved equally valuable. He sat down and wrote a document, a short document, barely a page, that articulated what Apple was for, what it believed, how it intended to treat the people who bought its products. The document said, among other things, that Apple would demonstrate empathy for its customers, that it would focus intensely on what it did rather than spreading itself thin, and that it would establish an impression of quality and lasting value, that the experience of an Apple product should feel, from the first moment, like the product of a company that genuinely cared. Steve Jobs read that document and recognized in its language his own deepest convictions. This was what he had been trying to say. This was what he had felt in his bones since the days in his father's garage. A company was not just an entity that made things. It was a statement of values. It was a promise to the people it served. He would spend the rest of his life trying to keep that promise. Now the work of building the Apple II could begin in earnest. The Apple I had been, in retrospect, a proof of concept, elegant and important but limited, a product for enthusiasts. The Apple II was Steve's vision of what a personal computer could truly be. A complete, finished, polished product that anyone, not just engineers, not just hobbyists, but genuinely anyone, could take out of a box and use. Woz designed the machine with the same breathtaking technical elegance that had characterized the Apple I, but on a larger canvas. Color graphics, sound, a keyboard built in, a case, and here Steve's obsession with the exterior experience began to show itself clearly. Most computers of the era came as naked circuit boards, or were housed in plain metal boxes. Steve wanted something different. He wanted the Apple II to sit on a desk and look like it belonged there. Like it was a considered, intentional object. Like someone had thought not just about what it did but about what it was like to live with it. He went to the Hewlett-Packard design department and looked at how HP thought about the physical design of their products. He visited manufacturers. He thought about plastics and curves and the specific shade of beige that would make a computer feel warm rather than institutional. He was, in these months, inventing the idea that consumer electronics could be beautiful, that the physical form of a technology product was not an afterthought but an essential part of the product itself. The world did not yet have a word for what he was doing. Design thinking, user experience, human-centered design. All of these terms would come later, invented in part to describe what Steve Jobs had already been practicing instinctively since he first took apart a radio in his father's garage. The Apple II was introduced to the world at the West Coast Computer Fair in April of 1977. Steve had insisted on a presentation that was unlike anything the fair had seen before. Apple's booth was not a folding table with components laid out on it, the way most exhibitors presented themselves. It was a lit, designed space with finished machines displayed on proper surfaces, under proper lighting, looking for all the world like the products of a real company with a real future. People stopped. People stared. People lined up. The machine was beautiful. It worked. It was something you could imagine in your home, on your desk as a part of your actual life. For the first time, a meaningful number of ordinary people, not engineers, not hobbyists, but people who simply found the idea appealing, could look at a personal computer and think, I could use that. Orders began to come in. Not a trickle, a flood. The Apple II would go on to become one of the best-selling personal computers in history, staying in production in various forms for over a decade, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue and establishing Apple as one of the most important companies in the technology industry. But in April of 1977, none of that was certain yet. What was certain was simpler and in some ways more profound. Two young men and their partners had made something that had never existed before. Something that worked beautifully. Something that people wanted. They had started in a garage. Paul and Clara Jobs had watched all of this unfold from close range, had watched the garage fill with parts and people, had watched their son move through these months with an intensity that was sometimes difficult to be around and always impossible to look away from. They had made a promise long ago before Steve was even theirs. They had promised that he would have every opportunity. They could not have imagined in that moment what every opportunity would look like. But they had kept the promise. And in a garage on Chris Drive, their son had kept his. He was 22 years old. The company had a name, a product, and a vision. The garage was already too small. The world was about to find out what Apple was. Chapter 5. Apple II Boom and Early Success, 1977 to 1983. There is a particular kind of momentum that builds when the right product meets the right moment in history. It does not announce itself quietly. It does not ease its way into the world with apologies or hesitations. It arrives with a force that surprises even the people who made it, who believed in it, who fought for it, who poured everything they had into bringing it into existence. Because believing in something and watching it actually happen are two entirely different experiences. In the years between 1977 and 1983, Apple Computer did not simply grow. It erupted. And at the center of that eruption, simultaneously thrilled and driven and already pushing toward the next horizon, was a young man in his 20s who had not yet fully reckoned with the distance between the vision in his head and the patience required to bring other people along with him. This is the story of Apple's first great act. Of the machine that put a computer on the desks of ordinary Americans. Of the money and the fame and the complexity that followed. And of the seeds, planted quietly in these years of triumph, of the drama that was still to come. The Apple II had made its public debut in April of 1977 at the West Coast Computer Fair, and the response had been everything Steve hoped for and more. People had stopped at the booth. They had touched the machines. They had asked questions with the brightness in their eyes that only genuine desire produces. Orders had come in and kept coming. But desire, however genuine, needs a practical reason to become a purchase. A person might find a personal computer appealing in the abstract, might appreciate its elegance, might sense its potential, and still not be quite sure what they would actually do with it on a Tuesday morning. That question was answered decisively in 1979, with the arrival of a piece of software that had nothing to do with Apple but that transformed the Apple II from an interesting consumer product into an essential business tool. The software was called VisiCalc. VisiCalc was the world's first electronic spreadsheet. Created by Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston, it allowed a user to build a grid of numbers that would automatically recalculate when any single number changed. For accountants, for business owners, for anyone who had ever spent hours manually redoing columns of figures because one input had changed, it was nothing short of revolutionary. It turned the computer from a hobbyist's toy into a serious instrument of work. And for the first 2 years of its existence, VisiCalc ran only on the Apple II. Businesses bought Apple IIs to run VisiCalc. Then they bought more Apple IIs. Then their competitors bought Apple IIs. The machine that Steve and Woz had built in a garage on Chris Drive began appearing in offices across America, sitting on the desks of people who had never previously given a moment's thought to owning a computer. By 1980, Apple had sold over 100,000 Apple IIs. Revenue was climbing toward $300 million a year. The company had hundreds of employees. The garage was a memory replaced by a proper campus in Cupertino that was growing almost faster than it could be managed. And then, on December 12, 1980, Apple Computer went public. The initial public offering was one of the most anticipated in Silicon Valley history. The shares sold out almost immediately. In a single day, Apple created more millionaires than any company had since the Ford Motor Company went public decades before. Employees who had joined the company for the love of the work suddenly found themselves wealthy beyond anything they had imagined when they had sat around that garage workbench assembling circuit boards. Steve Jobs, 25 years old, became worth approximately $250 million in a single afternoon. It is the kind of number that is difficult to absorb. For a young man who had returned bottles for 5-cent deposits not so many years before, who had slept on dormitory floors and eaten free meals at the Hare Krishna temple, the transformation was almost surreal. And Steve, to his credit, seemed to understand, at least in these early years, that the money was not the point. It was validation, certainly. It was proof that what he had believed was real. But it was not the destination. The destination was always somewhere further ahead. It always had been. By the early 1980s, Apple was no longer the scrappy startup that had outgrown its garage. It was a corporation, a real one with real corporate structures and real corporate pressures and real corporate politics. And Steve Jobs, for all his genius, was discovering that the skills required to build a revolutionary product were not always the same skills required to manage a growing organization. He was 25, then 26, then 27. He was brilliant and he was difficult and he was, by most accounts of people who worked alongside him in these years, both the most inspiring and the most demanding presence in any room he occupied. He had developed what people around him sometimes called a reality distortion field, a quality of absolute conviction so powerful that it could bend the perceptions of those around him, making the impossible seem achievable, making ambitious deadlines feel like reasonable expectations, making people do things they would never have believed themselves capable of. It was an extraordinary gift. It produced extraordinary results. It also produced, with some regularity, extraordinary stress in the people who experienced it, who found themselves agreeing to things in Steve's presence that seemed, the moment he left the room, frankly impossible. He was not always easy. He could be blunt to the point of cruelty, dismissive of work that did not meet his standards in ways that left people feeling crushed rather than motivated. He had not yet fully learned, and this is something he would later acknowledge with unusual candor, that the truth delivered without compassion is not always more useful than the truth delivered with care. But the products kept being extraordinary. Even as the Apple II continued its remarkable run, Steve's attention had already moved decisively forward. He was constitutionally unable to stand still, unable to be satisfied with what had already been achieved when there was always something more interesting ahead. And in late 1979, he had an experience that would redirect the entire trajectory of not just Apple, but the history of personal computing. He visited Xerox PARC. The Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, was the research division of the Xerox Corporation, and it was, in the late 1970s, one of the most remarkable concentrations of technological innovation the world had ever seen. The researchers there had developed ideas that were years, sometimes decades, ahead of anything the commercial technology world had yet imagined. Among those ideas was a way of interacting with a computer that was entirely unlike the command line interfaces that dominated the industry. Instead of typing cryptic instructions and waiting for the computer to respond in kind, a user could move a small device, a mouse, across a desk, and a pointer on the screen would move in response. On that screen, instead of lines of text, there were windows, visual representations of files and folders and applications that could be opened and closed with a click. The interface was visual, intuitive, and immediate in a way that typing commands simply was not. It was called a graphical user interface, and Xerox had invented it. Xerox, for reasons that still puzzle historians of technology, had never fully committed to bringing this invention to the commercial market. It was as if they had found a treasure and not quite known what to do with it. Steve Jobs, walking into the demonstration room at Park and seeing the graphical interface for the first time, knew immediately what it was worth. He was, by accounts of people present that day, almost overwhelmed. He could not stay still. He kept interrupting, kept asking questions, kept pushing the demonstrators to show him more. He saw, with a clarity that was both his greatest gift and his greatest burden, the entire future that this technology made possible. He saw the computer as it could be, as it needed to be, for the vision he had carried since his earliest days to become real. A computer for everyone. Not just for engineers and programmers. A computer so intuitive, so natural, so human in its logic that anyone who sat down in front of it would understand immediately what to do. He drove back to Cupertino with his head full of fire. 2 projects consumed him in the years that followed. The first was the Lisa, a machine named, it was widely believed, after his daughter, though Steve's relationship with that acknowledgement was complicated. The Lisa was intended to be the first commercial computer with a graphical user interface, aimed at the business market and priced accordingly. The second project was smaller, scrappier, more secretive, and in every way more characteristic of the man Steve Jobs was becoming. It had begun as a lower-cost alternative, but under Steve's increasingly intense involvement, it had become something else entirely, a crusade. A statement. A declaration of what computing could be if someone cared enough to demand that every detail be right. It was called the Macintosh. Steve had essentially removed himself from the Lisa project, pushed out by internal politics and his own difficulty working within the constraints of a large team, and had joined the Macintosh project with the ferocious energy of someone who has been told they cannot do the thing they most want to do. He gathered around him a small team of engineers and designers and writers who were, by his selection, the people he considered the best in the company. He put a pirate flag above their building, a genuine pirate flag, a Jolly Roger, because he wanted his team to understand that they were not playing by ordinary rules. They were raiding the future. It is better to be a pirate, Steve told them, than to join the Navy. The Macintosh team worked with an intensity that was, in the recollections of its members, unlike anything they had experienced before or would experience again. Steve pushed them constantly, past deadlines they thought were final, past technical limits they believed were fixed, past their own conceptions of what they could achieve. He could be, in these years, genuinely inspired and genuinely brutal, sometimes in the same conversation. He told his engineers that their work would put a dent in the universe, and he meant it completely, and the remarkable thing was that they believed him too, even when he was making their lives extraordinarily difficult. Because the product was taking shape. And the product was extraordinary. By 1982, Steve Jobs appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He was 27 years old. The headline called him a different kind of computer wizard. Someone who was not just building technology but reimagining what technology was for. Apple was, by this point, one of the fastest-growing companies in American history. The Apple II had made the company. The Macintosh was going to change it again. And Steve, standing at the intersection of all this momentum, was both the architect of everything that had been built and the restless force already straining toward what came next. But 1982 also brought the first deep shadow across what had been, until then, largely a story of ascent. The company had hired a professional CEO, a man named Mike Scott, and then, after Scott's troubled tenure, had brought in John Scully, the president of Pepsi-Cola, whom Steve had personally recruited with a challenge that became one of the most famous lines in business history. "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life?" Steve had asked him, "or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Scully had come. And for a time, the partnership seemed to work. Steve's visionary intensity paired with Scully's managerial experience and his understanding of marketing and brand. Steve and Scully spent hours together in these early years, walking and talking with the intensity of two people who recognized in each other a seriousness of purpose that not everyone they knew possessed. But beneath the surface of that partnership, even in its warmest days, were fault lines that would eventually crack wide open. Steve was not easy to manage. Steve was, in the most precise sense, unmanageable, not because he was capricious, but because his conviction was total and his patience for compromise was limited. He believed in the right answer, and when he had found it, the fact that others disagreed was not, to his mind, a reason to reconsider. It was simply a delay to be overcome. The reckoning between Steve Jobs and Apple's corporate structure was coming. But not quite yet. In 1983, the Lisa was released. It was, technically, a remarkable machine, the first commercially available computer with a graphical user interface. It was also expensive, slow, and not entirely ready for the demands of the real business world. It did not sell well. It was, by the standards Apple had set for itself, a disappointment. Steve did not dwell on it. The Macintosh was coming. Everything was converging on a single point. The years of building and fighting and pushing and insisting. The calligraphy class and the garage and the pirate flag. The memory of his father painting the back of the fence. The lessons of India and Reed College and the homebrew computer club. The absolute, unshakable belief that a computer could be not just useful but beautiful, not just functional but joyful, not just a tool but a genuine expression of human creativity. All of it was converging on January 1984. On a commercial that would air once during the Super Bowl and be remembered for decades. On a machine that would carry, in its very design, the accumulated convictions of a young man's entire life. The Macintosh was almost here. He had taken a company from a garage to the cover of Time magazine. He had changed the way the world thought about what a computer could be. But the most dramatic chapter of his story, both the greatest triumph and the darkest fall, was only just beginning. The pirate flag was flying. The Navy was paying attention. Chapter 6. Macintosh Launch and Power Struggles, 1983 to 1985. There are moments in the history of technology that divide time into before and after. Moments so clean and so complete that it becomes genuinely difficult, once they have passed, to remember what the world felt like on the other side of them. The introduction of the telephone. The first television broadcast. The night the internet became something ordinary people used. January 24, 1984, was one of those moments. And the man who made it happen was 38 days away from his 29th birthday, standing in the wings of a theater in Cupertino, California, about to walk out in front of an audience and change the world. He was wearing a double-breasted suit with a bow tie, not his later uniform of black turtleneck and jeans, not yet, but already something deliberate, already something considered, already the costume of a person who understood that presentation was not vanity but communication. He was nervous in the way that only people who care completely can be nervous. And he was ready in the way that only people who have given everything can be ready. He walked out onto the stage. And what followed was not just a product launch. It was a performance, a declaration, a piece of theater that the technology industry had never seen before and would spend decades trying to replicate. But before we stand in that auditorium, we need to go back to the months and years of work that made the moment possible, and to the extraordinary commercial that prepared the world to receive it. It was called 1984. Directed by Ridley Scott, who had just finished Blade Runner and brought to the project a visual imagination of tremendous force, it aired exactly once on national television, during the third quarter of Super Bowl XVIII, on January 22, 1984, 2 days before the Macintosh launch. The commercial showed a gray, dystopian world, rows of shaven-headed figures marching in lockstep, staring at a giant screen on which a figure of absolute authority delivered pronouncements in a cold, booming voice. The imagery was unmistakable in its reference. George Orwell's novel, The Totalitarian Future, the crushing of individual thought beneath the weight of conformity. And then, running into that gray world, came a young woman in bright athletic clothing, carrying a sledgehammer. She ran toward the screen. She swung the hammer. The screen exploded in a shattering burst of light. A voice spoke over the stunned silence that followed. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984 ***. The audience in the Super Bowl stadium erupted. America talked about it the next morning at breakfast tables and office water coolers. It was the most discussed advertisement in the country, and it had aired exactly once. IBM was the giant screen. Apple was the woman with the sledgehammer. The Macintosh was the light. Steve Jobs had not just made a product. He had made a mythology. And in doing so, he had given his audience something that no amount of technical specification could provide. A reason to care, a story to be part of, a side to be on. Now the theater in Cupertino. Now the moment itself. Steve walked to the center of the stage and began to speak. He told the audience that he had been looking forward to this moment for over a year. He quoted Bob Dylan. Of course he quoted Bob Dylan, the opening lines of The Times They Are A-Changin', that anthem of transformation and refusal, because it was the most natural thing in the world for him to reach for music when he needed to say something that mere prose could not quite carry. He told the audience that IBM wanted it all, that the personal computer revolution they had helped start had been threatened by the arrival of the corporate giant, that the question of who would prevail would determine the future of the industry. And then he said, "But we're not going to let that happen." There was a pause. He reached into a bag and removed a flat beige object, smaller than anyone expected, almost startlingly compact, and set it on the podium. "The most insanely great thing I've ever done," he had called it to his team. Now he was showing it to the world. He typed a command. The floppy disk drive word. And then, for the first time in public, the Macintosh spoke. In a synthesized voice that carried through the auditorium with an almost surreal clarity, the machine introduced itself. "Hello. I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag." The audience lost its composure entirely. They rose to their feet. They cheered and they laughed and they kept cheering. Steve Jobs stood at the podium with tears running down his face, not performing emotion, not managing the moment, but genuinely moved, overwhelmed by what he had spent years working toward and had finally actually brought into the world. It was, by any measure, one of the great product launches in the history of American business. And the Macintosh was, by any honest assessment, everything Steve had promised it would be. The machine itself deserves a moment of genuine appreciation because it is easy, with the distance of decades, to take for granted what it represented. The Macintosh had a graphical user interface, Windows icons, a mouse, a desktop that mimicked the physical experience of working at an actual desk, at a price that, while not cheap, was a fraction of what the Lisa had cost. It had a screen and a keyboard integrated into a single elegant unit. It had typography that treated the visual appearance of text as something worthy of genuine artistic attention, the legacy, in a direct and traceable line, of that calligraphy class at Reed College. It was opinionated in the way that only products made by people with strong convictions can be. Steve had decided, and the team had built accordingly, that there were right ways and wrong ways to use a computer, and the Macintosh was designed to guide its user toward the right ways without ever making them feel commanded or constrained. It was, in this sense, a deeply humanistic machine. It respected the person using it. It assumed that the person using it was intelligent and curious and deserving of an experience that was genuinely good. No one had built a computer like that before. The reaction from the technology press was, initially, a mixture of genuine awe and cautious reservation. The machine was beautiful and the interface was revolutionary, but it was also slow by the standards of what programmers were used to, and its memory was limited, and it had only one floppy drive, and there was, in those first months, a shortage of software to run on it. These were real limitations. Steve knew they were real limitations. He had pushed his team to ship before every problem was solved, because he also knew, with the instinct of a person who understood both technology and human desire, that a revolutionary product released imperfectly was worth infinitely more than a perfect product never released at all. The months following the launch were, for Steve, a complicated mixture of triumph and turbulence. The Macintosh sold well at first. Apple sold 50,000 units in the first 3 months, which was better than any comparable product launch in the company's history. The machine was on the covers of magazines. It was in the hands of writers and designers and educators who immediately grasped what it could do for them. The concept of desktop publishing, of ordinary people being able to design and produce documents of professional quality without expensive equipment or specialized training, was being born, and the Macintosh was its cradle. But the sales after that initial burst began to slow. The limitations were real and the competition was real. IBM's personal computer, running software from a small Seattle company called Microsoft, had arrived with the backing of the largest technology corporation in the world and was spreading through the business community with a speed that Apple could not match. The Apple II, still generating the majority of Apple's revenue, was beginning to show its age. And internally, the company was under pressures that its rapid growth had created and that its leadership had not yet found ways to manage. Steve was increasingly at the center of these pressures, and increasingly, in ways that were painful and honest, a contributor to them. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about Steve Jobs in these years that requires both honesty and fairness to hold simultaneously. He was, by the accounts of the people who worked most closely with him, a person of genuine greatness and genuine difficulty. These were not separate things, they were, in many ways, the same thing expressed differently. The conviction that produced the Macintosh was the same conviction that made him, in his darker moments, dismissive and unfair and unwilling to acknowledge the contributions of others. The perfectionism that made his products extraordinary was the same perfectionism that could make a team meeting feel like a tribunal. He had not yet learned to separate his vision from his ego. He had not yet found the balance between demanding excellence and allowing the people around him the dignity of their own intelligence. He was 28, then 29, and he was one of the most famous people in American business, and no one in his life had sufficient standing to tell him things he did not want to hear. The Macintosh team, which had once been bound together by the shared intensity of building something great, began to fracture under the pressure of shipping deadlines and internal conflicts. Key engineers departed. The atmosphere, once electric with possibility, grew strained. And the relationship between Steve Jobs and John Sculley, which had begun with such mutual admiration and genuine warmth, was beginning, quietly but unmistakably, to curdle. The fault lines ran deep and they ran in multiple directions. Sculley had been hired to bring order and professional management to a company that was growing faster than its organizational structures could support. He had come from Pepsi, where he had been a brilliant marketing executive, and he brought to Apple a different kind of intelligence than Steve's, systematic, process-oriented, focused on the structures that allowed large organizations to function reliably over time. Steve respected Sculley's marketing instincts. He had, after all, recruited the man himself, with that challenge about sugar water and changing the world. But as the months passed, Steve found himself increasingly frustrated with what he saw as Sculley's conservatism. His unwillingness to take the kinds of risks that Steve believed were essential to Apple's future, his tendency to listen to the voices of caution when Steve's instincts were screaming in the opposite direction. And Sculley, for his part, was discovering that managing Steve Jobs was unlike managing anything he had encountered before. Steve's contempt for hierarchy, his willingness to go around organizational structures when they stood between him and what he wanted, his absolute certainty that he was right, these qualities, which had been thrilling when Sculley saw them from the outside, were considerably more difficult when they were directed at him from the inside. By early 1985, the tension between them had become the central drama of Apple Computer. The specific dispute that brought matters to a head was the question of the Macintosh's commercial performance. Sales had slowed significantly after the initial launch period, and the question of why and what to do about it divided the company's leadership. Steve believed the answer was to double down, to invest more heavily in the Macintosh, to push forward with the vision, to trust that the market would catch up to the product if Apple held its nerve. He was, characteristically, unwilling to accept that the slowdown reflected a fundamental problem with the machine itself. Sculley and the broader Apple board saw things differently. The numbers were the numbers. The company's overall performance was weakening. The Apple II division, which Steve had long treated as a legacy concern, the past rather than the future, was still generating the majority of the company's revenue, and its leaders were deeply resentful of the way Steve had dismissed their work and their contributions. The board began to question, carefully at first and then more openly, whether Steve Jobs was the right person to lead the Macintosh division. His management style was creating problems. His relationship with Sculley was deteriorating. The product, for all its brilliance, was not performing as he had promised it would. Steve sensed the ground shifting beneath him. And he did what he had always done when he sensed resistance: he pushed back harder. He began talking to board members directly. He began suggesting, in conversations he believed were private, that the problem at Apple was not him but Sculley, that it was Sculley who lacked the vision to understand what Apple needed to do next. Those conversations were not as private as Steve believed. The crisis came to a head in the spring of 1985. Sculley brought the matter before Apple's board of directors. The board sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs was removed from his operational role overseeing the Macintosh division. He retained his title as chairman, which meant he was still formally connected to the company he had founded, but he had been stripped of the thing that actually mattered to him. He had been stripped of the ability to build. The man who had stood on that stage in January 1984, tears on his face and the future in his hands, was 30 years old, and the company he had created in a garage had told him, in the most direct terms available, that it no longer wanted him in charge. He was not graceful about it initially. He was wounded and he was angry, and he was, beneath the anger, something more complicated, something that might have been confusion, the genuine bewilderment of a person who has poured everything into something and cannot understand how the thing can exist without him at the center of it. He took a trip to Europe. He tried to think. He visited a school in Italy and watched children learning on computers and felt, amid everything else, the original conviction reassert itself. The belief that technology made right could genuinely transform lives. He came home. He resigned from Apple Computer in September of 1985. He sold all but one share of his Apple stock, a gesture of hurt as much as practicality, a way of making the break feel clean when nothing about it was clean. He was 30 years old. He had co-founded one of the most important companies in the world, had produced one of the most celebrated products in the history of technology, and had just been thrown out of the house he built. But here is the thing about Steve Jobs that the story of his expulsion from Apple must ultimately rest on, the thing that makes this chapter not a tragedy but a turning point. He did not stop. He could not stop. It was not in him to stop. The same quality that had made him difficult to manage, the absolute, unshakable conviction that he had something important to contribute, that the work was not finished, that there was always more to build and more to discover, was precisely the quality that would not allow him to interpret this devastating setback as an ending. He had been, he would say later, liberated. Not immediately, not in the first raw weeks of the wound. But eventually and genuinely. The heaviness of running a large corporation, the political complexity, the distance from the actual work of making things, all of that had fallen away. He was free for the first time in years to start again. He had done it once in a garage with a circuit board and a vision and the unearned confidence of someone who does not yet know what he cannot do. He would do it again. 30 years old. No company. No team. No product. And absolutely no intention of stopping. The garage was gone. But the man who had built everything that came after was still standing. The next chapter was about to begin, and it would prove in time to be the education that made everything else possible. Chapter 7. Exile. Next in Pixar Beginnings, 1985 to 1990, there is a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after loss. Not immediately, not in the first raw days when the wound is fresh and the world feels smaller than it did before. But later, when the noise settles and the defensiveness softens and a person is left alone with the most honest version of themselves. The clarity that comes from having had everything and losing it and discovering that you are still standing. That you are, in fact, still you. Steve Jobs had lost Apple. He had lost it in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. Pushed out of the company he had founded, stripped of his operational role, his departure announced to the world while he was still in the building. He was 30 years old, one of the most recognizable figures in American business, and suddenly, for the first time since he was a teenager assembling circuit boards in his father's garage, he had no product to build and no team to build it with. What he did with that emptiness, how he filled it, what he learned from it, and who he became on the other side of it, is one of the most instructive passages of his entire life. Because the years between 1985 and 1990 were not, as they might easily have been, the years of a man in decline. They were the years of a man in transformation. Painful transformation. Slow transformation. The kind that does not announce itself in headlines or product launches but happens quietly, in offices and editing suites and late-night conversations, in the accumulated experience of building things that do not always work and managing people without the safety net of an already famous name. They were, in the deepest sense, the years that made him ready for what came after. The first thing Steve did after leaving Apple, with the characteristic urgency of someone who cannot remain still, was start a new company. He called it Next. The name carried an implicit promise that what came next would be better, more advanced, more fully realized than what had come before. It was also, perhaps, a statement of personal defiance. Apple had decided Steve Jobs was its past. Steve Jobs had decided he was everyone's future. He recruited a small team, several of whom had followed him from Apple, a fact that did not go unnoticed or uncontested by the company he had just left. Apple initially threatened legal action, claiming that Steve had recruited key employees in violation of his duties as a departing executive. The dispute was eventually settled, but it added a layer of bitterness to a separation that was already painful enough. Steve established Next in Palo Alto, in a building that was, from the beginning, unmistakably his, clean, spare, beautifully designed, a physical space that made an argument about what the company believed before a single product had been built. He hired a graphic designer named Paul Rand who had created some of the most iconic corporate logos in American history, the logos for IBM, for ABC, for UPS, and paid him $100,000 for a single logo. Paul Rand was 71 years old, and he delivered a booklet explaining the logo's design philosophy along with the logo itself, because he believed, as Steve believed, that great design was not just a result but a process, and the process deserved to be understood. The logo was a cube. Black, set at an angle with the company's name broken across its faces. It was elegant and a little severe and entirely memorable. Steve loved it without reservation. The mission of Next, as Steve articulated it in these early years, was to build a computer for higher education, specifically for universities and research institutions, where the need for serious computational power and sophisticated software was pressing and where, Steve believed, the personal computer revolution had not yet fully arrived in its best form. It was, in retrospect, a vision shaped as much by his expulsion from the consumer market as by any genuine strategic insight. Apple owned the consumer space or was fighting for it. The corporate world was increasingly IBM's terrain. Universities were a gap, a real gap with real needs, and Steve moved toward that gap with his characteristic conviction that he could fill it better than anyone else. But Next was also, from its very earliest days, something more than a business strategy. It was a statement of values. Steve was determined, this time, to build a company that embodied everything he had learned and everything he believed, not just about technology but about design, about craftsmanship, about the relationship between a product and the person who uses it. He was going to do it right. Completely right. Every detail. That conviction was both the company's greatest strength and, as would become increasingly clear, a significant source of its difficulties. The Next computer, eventually called simply the Next Cube for the shape of its remarkable magnesium case, was, by every technical measure, extraordinarily ambitious. Steve had decided that the machine would be housed in a perfect cube, 12 inches on each side, made of a magnesium alloy that gave it a weight and solidity unlike anything in the consumer technology market. The manufacturing process required to make that cube was so precise, and so expensive, that it contributed significantly to a product cost that would eventually make the machine almost impossible to sell at a price ordinary universities could afford. But Steve was not thinking about price in those early years. He was thinking about rightness. He was thinking about what the machine should be, not what it should cost. This was the same impulse that had made the original Macintosh extraordinary, and it was the same impulse that would consistently push Next products beyond the reach of their intended market. He was learning, slowly and at considerable cost, that the gap between visionary and practical is not always as narrow as conviction makes it feel. The software, however, was a different story. The operating system that Steve's team built for the Next Cube, called Next Step, was, by genuine consensus among the engineers and developers who worked with it, one of the most advanced pieces of software ever written. It was object-oriented in ways that made programming more elegant and more powerful. It had an interface of remarkable sophistication. It was, technically, years ahead of anything Apple was shipping, years ahead of what Microsoft would offer for years to come. A young British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee would use a Next Cube to create the World Wide Web in 1989. The machine on which the Internet as we know it was invented was a Next. That is not a minor footnote. That is the measure of what Steve's team built in those years of exile. But we cannot tell the story of Steve Jobs between 1985 and 1990 without turning, at roughly the same moment in the chronology, to a very different kind of company, one that had nothing to do with computers in the conventional sense, and everything to do with the other great passion of Steve's creative life. In February of 1986, Steve Jobs purchased a small computer graphics division from the filmmaker George Lucas for $5 million, with a commitment to invest a further $5 million in its operations. The division had been part of Lucasfilm, the company behind the Star Wars films, where it had been working on the use of computer graphics in movie making. George Lucas was going through a difficult personal period, a divorce that was proving expensive, and was looking to sell the division. Steve saw it, in the way he had always seen things others were not quite looking at, and understood immediately what it could become. He renamed it Pixar. The Pixar that Steve bought in 1986 was not yet a film studio. It was a hardware company primarily. It made a specialized piece of equipment called the Pixar Image Computer, intended for medical imaging and government applications. It had a small team of extraordinarily talented computer graphics artists and engineers, led by a gentle visionary man named Ed Catmull, and it had, in the work those artists were producing, the unmistakable evidence of a creative intelligence that was doing something genuinely new. There was also, in the Pixar team, a man named John Lasseter, an animator of extraordinary gift who had been, in a previous chapter of his life, let go by Disney for being too enthusiastic about the possibilities of computer animation. Lasseter was making short films at Pixar that were unlike anything the animation world had produced. Films that used the computer not as a replacement for human imagination but as a new instrument for expressing it. His 1986 short, Luxo Jr., featuring 2 desk lamps, one large and one small, playing with a ball in what was unmistakably a relationship between a parent and a child, was nominated for an Academy Award and announced to the world that computer animation could tell stories that mattered. Steve watched Luxo Jr. and understood what he was looking at. He understood it the way he had understood the graphical interface at Xerox PARC, not as an incremental improvement on what already existed but as the seed of an entirely different future. He did not yet know exactly what form that future would take. But he knew it was real and he was willing to invest in it. He would invest, over the years that followed, more than $50 million of his own money in Pixar. Money he could afford given the Apple stock he had sold, but money that represented a genuine bet, a genuine commitment to a vision that had no guaranteed return. In these same years, Steve's personal life was undergoing changes of its own. He had a daughter, Lisa, born in 1978 to a woman named Chris N. Brennan, with whom he had a complicated and often painful relationship. His initial denial of paternity, a denial that stood in such obvious contrast to the evidence and that he would later acknowledge with regret, was one of the less admirable chapters of a life that contained several. Lisa grew up largely without her father in her early years, a wound that both of them would spend years trying to heal. But in 1985, Steve met a woman named Tina Retz, a relationship of genuine emotional intensity that would occupy much of the next several years. And in 1986, he met, at a dinner in the company of mutual friends, a graduate student in education policy at Stanford named Laureen Powell. He did not immediately pursue it. The timing was not right, and Steve in these years was still learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be in relationships that required the kind of patience and presence that had always been harder for him than making products. But the meeting left its mark. Something had been registered. The late 1980s were, for Next, a period of growing tension between ambition and reality. The Next Cube finally shipped in October of 1988, 3 years after the company's founding, well behind the schedule Steve had initially announced. The launch event was characteristically magnificent. Steve had rented Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco for the occasion, and the presentation was everything his product launches had always been: theatrical, precise, moving, designed to make the audience feel they were witnessing something historic. And the machine was genuinely extraordinary. The reviewers who examined it closely were lavish in their technical praise. The software was remarkable. The hardware was beautiful. The integration of the two was, in certain respects, unmatched by anything else available. But it cost nearly $10,000. Universities, which had been the intended market, could not afford it in meaningful numbers. The broader business market, which might have been a natural alternative audience, was already committed to the IBM-compatible world. The consumer market, the market Steve had always understood best, was simply out of reach at that price. Next was a company that kept producing things of genuine brilliance and struggling, persistently and painfully, to find enough customers to sustain itself. The manufacturing facility Steve had built in Fremont, a gleaming, automated production floor that was as beautiful as any factory in the world, was running far below capacity. The costs were mounting. The revenues were not keeping pace. Steve was learning something he had not had to learn at Apple, where the Apple II had generated the revenue that funded everything, which was what it felt like to build extraordinary things in the absence of commercial success. What it felt like to maintain conviction when the market was not confirming it. What it felt like to be right about the technology and still struggling to survive. It was not a comfortable education, but it was a necessary one. He was also, in these years, changing in ways that were less visible than product launches or financial statements but ultimately more important. The Steve Jobs who had left Apple in 1985 was, by the accounts of people who knew him well, someone whose brilliance and difficulty were so thoroughly intertwined that it was sometimes impossible to receive the one without enduring the other. He was learning, in these years of exile, to begin the long and unfinished work of separating them. He was spending time with his daughter Lisa. More time, slowly more time, imperfectly but genuinely. He was in a relationship that required him to be present in ways that building products did not. He was managing teams at both Next and Pixar without the protection of an already legendary reputation, which forced him to rely on persuasion and vision rather than the sheer gravitational force of being Steve Jobs of Apple. He was meditating still. Sitting with the Zen practices that had anchored him since his days at Reed College. Finding, in the discipline of stillness, some small counterweight to the relentless forward drive that was both his greatest quality and his most exhausting one. He was reading as he had always read, widely, hungrily, with the appetite of a person who believes that the next book might contain something essential. He was thinking about what kind of leader he wanted to be, what kind of man, what kind of father. These were not questions he was answering cleanly or quickly. But he was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, genuinely asking them. By 1990, the broad outlines of Steve Jobs' exile were clear, even if their ultimate resolution was not. Next was alive but struggling, producing work of genuine technical magnificence while fighting for the commercial traction that would allow it to survive. Pixar was alive but struggling in different ways, a hardware company that had not yet found its true identity as a storytelling studio, sustained by Steve's investment and by the growing conviction of its creative team that they were on the edge of something remarkable. And Steve himself was alive in a way he had perhaps not been during the frenetic ascent of Apple's early years. More reflective, more aware of his own limitations, more willing to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it into action. He was 35 years old. He had two companies that were both, in different ways, unfinished. He had a daughter he was slowly learning to know. He had a future that was genuinely open in a way it had not been since before the Apple II made him famous. The exile was not over. There were more hard years ahead, more financial pressure, more difficult lessons, more moments of doubt in the quiet hours when even the most confident person has to face the distance between what they intended and what they have achieved. But something had been built in these years that no product launch could reveal and no financial statement could measure. Something interior. Something durable. Steve Jobs had always known how to make things. He was learning now how to be someone. Two companies. Neither of them Apple. Both of them becoming, in ways he could not yet fully see, exactly what he needed. The world had written him off. The world had done that before. It would need to revise its opinion. Chapter 8. Pixar Triumphs and Next Evolution, 1990 to 1996. There is something quietly profound about the middle of a story. Not the beginning, with its energy and innocence and the particular freedom of someone who does not yet know what failure feels like. Not the end, with its resolution and retrospect and the clean lines that hindsight draws across what was, in the living of it, considerably messier. The middle is where the real work happens. Where character is tested not by dramatic crisis but by the slower, more demanding trial of persistence. Of continuing when continuation is neither glamorous nor guaranteed. Steve Jobs, in the years between 1990 and 1996, was deep in the middle of his story. And the middle was asking more of him than the beginning ever had. He had two companies, both of them carrying the weight of his ambition and his investment. Next was producing technology of genuine brilliance and struggling, with equal consistency, to turn that brilliance into commercial survival. Pixar was something harder still to categorize. A hardware company that was slowly, painfully, magnificently discovering that its true nature was something else entirely. Neither company had yet delivered the vindication Steve needed. But both of them were moving, in ways that were not always visible from the outside, toward something extraordinary. You just had to hold on long enough to see it. Pixar's journey in these years is the more dramatic of the two stories, so let us begin there, with the slow, arduous, ultimately triumphant transformation of a struggling hardware company into the most creatively successful animation studio the world had ever seen. By 1990, Pixar had been alive for 4 years under Steve's ownership, and it had not yet found its footing in any financially stable sense. The Pixar Image Computer, the hardware product that had been the company's primary commercial offering, was not selling in meaningful numbers. The medical imaging and government markets it had targeted were real, but they were not large enough or enthusiastic enough to sustain a company with Pixar's ambitions and cost structure. Steve had already invested far more money than he had originally intended. He had gone in expecting to spend around $10 million. The actual figure was climbing steadily past $50 million, drawn from the fortune he had accumulated during Apple's early years. It was not money he could not afford to lose in the strict sense. He was not in danger of personal financial ruin. But it was real money, a genuine bet, and the returns were not appearing on any schedule he had imagined. There were moments in the early 1990s when Steve came genuinely close to selling Pixar. He had conversations with potential buyers. He explored what a sale might look like. The company's financial situation was serious enough, and the path to profitability was unclear enough, that walking away was a rational option that serious people were seriously recommending to him. He did not walk away. Partly this was stubbornness, the quality that had always been both his greatest strength and his most significant liability, the refusal to accept that something he believed in had reached the end of its possibilities. But partly and increasingly it was something more considered. Because Steve had spent enough time around the Pixar team by this point to understand, with the same clarity of perception that had shown him the future in the Xerox PARC demonstration room, that what these people were doing was genuinely historic. John Lasseter was making short films that stopped people in their tracks. Ed Catmull was building a technical infrastructure for computer animation that was solving problems no one had solved before. The combination of artistic vision and technical excellence at Pixar was unlike anything Steve had encountered elsewhere, and he had encountered a great deal. These were people who cared about their work in the way he cared about his. People who would not accept good enough when extraordinary was theoretically possible. He recognized them. They were, in the most essential way, his people. The pivot that saved Pixar came from an unexpected direction, or rather from the direction that had always been the company's deepest truth, even when its business model was pointing elsewhere. In 1991, Pixar signed an agreement with Disney to produce a series of computer-animated feature films. Disney would provide the financing and handle distribution. Pixar would provide the creative vision and the technical execution. The deal was not, on its face, overwhelmingly favorable to Pixar. Disney retained significant control and a large share of the profits. Steve negotiated the terms personally with a combination of tenacity and strategic intelligence that characterized his best business work, but he was negotiating from a position of genuine need, and the terms reflected that reality. Pixar needed Disney more than Disney needed Pixar, and both parties understood this. But the deal was real and it was a foundation. For the first time, Pixar had a path to making the thing it was actually built to make. Feature films. Stories. The kind of work that could reach not just technical reviewers and animation specialists but ordinary people sitting in darkened theaters with their children beside them, waiting to be moved. The film they were going to make first was about toys. About the secret lives of toys when the humans who owned them were not in the room. It was a simple premise in the way that the best premises always are. Simple on the surface, inexhaustible in its possibilities for character and emotion and the particular kind of truth that only fiction can tell. They called it Toy Story. The making of Toy Story between 1991 and 1995 is a story of creative difficulty and technical innovation on a scale that is difficult to fully convey. The tools for making a computer-animated feature film did not entirely exist when Pixar started making one. They had to be built as the film was being made, which meant that the technical and creative teams were solving unprecedented problems simultaneously under conditions of considerable pressure. There were moments when the film nearly collapsed. Disney, at one point in 1993, reviewed the early footage and found it lacking in warmth and humanity. The characters were coming across as sarcastic and unlikable. The story felt cold. Disney considered shutting the production down. Pixar was given a short window to fix what was broken. The creative team went back. They rethought. They reached deeper into the characters, found the warmth and vulnerability that had been obscured by the attempt at edge, and rebuilt the film around an emotional core that was simpler and truer than what they had been trying to achieve. The film that came out of that crisis was better, in every important sense, than the film that had gone in. Steve watched all of this from a position that required of him something genuinely difficult: restraint. He was not a filmmaker. He did not have the specific expertise that Ed Catmull and John Lasseter possessed. He could not walk into the creative process and improve it the way he could walk into a hardware design session and improve that. His role at Pixar was different from his role at Next, and learning to inhabit that difference, learning to trust people whose expertise he could not replicate, was part of the education these years were giving him. He contributed where he could. He pushed on the business side, on the deals, on the marketing. He insisted on standards of quality that matched his own. He was, in the recollections of the Pixar team, a demanding and sometimes difficult presence who was also genuinely and consistently in their corner, who believed in what they were making, who would fight for them when fighting was required. Toy Story was released on November 22, 1995. It was the first feature film ever made entirely with computer animation. It was also, without qualification, a masterpiece, funny and tender and visually astonishing, a film that worked simultaneously as a children's adventure and as a genuinely moving story about friendship, loyalty, and the fear of being left behind. The critical response was overwhelming. The box office response was even more so. Toy Story earned over $370 million worldwide on a production budget of $30 million. It was the highest-grossing film of 1995. It was nominated for 3 Academy Awards. It announced to the world that Pixar was not a technical curiosity but a great storytelling studio, and that computer animation was not a novelty but a legitimate and powerful artistic form. Steve Jobs had held on long enough. The vindication had arrived. 3 weeks after Toy Story opened, Steve took Pixar public. The initial public offering raised over $130 million and valued the company at nearly $1.5 billion. Steve, who owned approximately 80% of Pixar, found himself in a single afternoon, wealthier than he had ever been. Wealthier, in fact, than his Apple stock had made him at the height of the company's first great run. He was 40 years old. He had spent a decade in exile. And he had just produced, almost in passing, one of the most successful animated films in history and one of the most successful IPOs of the year. The world, once again, needed to revise its understanding of Steve Jobs. But there was another story running parallel to Pixar's triumph. A story that was less cinematic, less immediately satisfying, but in many ways more directly consequential for the technology that billions of people would one day use every day. This was the story of Next, and it is a story that requires a different kind of attention, because its significance was not visible in box office numbers or stock prices but in the quality of the work itself. Next, through the early 1990s, continued to produce technology that impressed everyone who looked at it closely and struggled to find the commercial scale that would make it financially self-sustaining. Steve had made significant changes to the company's direction in these years, pivoting away from the hardware business, which was costing far more than it was generating, and focusing instead on the software that had always been Next's deepest strength. The Next Step operating system was, by the early 1990s, widely recognized among serious software developers as the most sophisticated personal computer operating system in existence. It was object-oriented in ways that made software development faster, more reliable, and more elegant. It had an interface that was powerful without being complicated. It was the kind of software that people who understood software recognized immediately as something qualitatively different from what everyone else was building. Steve discontinued the Next hardware line in 1993, a decision that required swallowing a significant amount of pride, given that the Cube had been such a personal statement, such a physical embodiment of his beliefs about design and craft. But the decision was right, and Steve made it with more pragmatism than many who knew him would have predicted. He was learning to distinguish between the things that mattered and the things that were expressions of the things that mattered. The Cube had been an expression. The software was the thing itself. Next, renamed Next Software and focused entirely on its operating system and development tools, found a more stable footing. It was not growing rapidly. It was not generating the kind of revenues that would make investors excited. But it was alive, and the technology it was producing was real, and the people who were using Next Step were, with remarkable consistency, becoming its passionate advocates. Among those advocates were the engineers at a number of major corporations who had standardized their internal development on Next tools. Among them, as previously noted, was Tim Berners-Lee, whose creation of the World Wide Web on a Next Cube in 1989 had seeded the most significant technological development of the decade. The Internet was growing through the early 1990s, with a speed that surprised almost everyone, and the tools that Next had built were, in various ways, part of the infrastructure of that growth. Steve was watching the Internet's emergence with the same quality of attention he had brought to the graphical interface at Xerox PARC. He understood, with the instinct that was his most reliable guide, that this was not a trend but a transformation. That the network was going to change everything: how people communicated, how they worked, how they learned, how they shopped, how they thought about the relationship between a computer and the wider world. He did not yet know exactly how Next would fit into that transformation. but he was paying attention. In his personal life, these years brought changes of enormous significance. He had continued to develop his relationship with Laureen Powell, the Stanford graduate student he had met at that dinner in 1986, and in March of 1991 Steve and Laureen were married. The ceremony was held at the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite National Park, conducted by a Zen Buddhist monk, in a setting of extraordinary beauty that seemed to everyone present entirely right for two people who were both, in their different ways, deeply serious about what they were doing. Their first child, Reed Paul Jobs, named in part for the college that had shaped his father so profoundly, was born in September of 1991. A daughter, Erin Sienna Jobs, followed in 1995. Another daughter, Eve Jobs, would arrive in 1998. The man who had been, in his younger years, a difficult and sometimes absent figure in the life of his daughter Lisa was becoming, with genuine effort and genuine love, a father in a fuller and more present sense. It was not a transformation that happened overnight, and it was not without its difficulties and its failures. But it was real, and the people who knew Steve in these years saw in him a groundedness, a warmth, a capacity for domestic life that had not always been visible in the driven, electric young man who had stood on that stage in Cupertino and wept at the sound of a computer saying hello. He was becoming more whole. The exile, with all its difficulties, was doing what exile sometimes does for people strong enough to survive it. It was teaching him who he was when he was not defined by what he was building. By 1995 and into 1996, the landscape around Steve was shifting in ways that were bringing his two parallel stories, the Pixar story and the Next story, toward different kinds of resolution. Pixar had triumphed spectacularly and publicly. Next had survived and refined itself and was carrying, in its software, a set of ideas about how computers should work that were among the most advanced in the industry. And Apple, the company that had expelled him, the company he had not run for a decade, was in serious trouble. The details of Apple's decline in these years are the details of a company that had lost its way. The Macintosh, without the driving force of its creator, had evolved in ways that were competent but not inspired. The operating system had aged. The hardware had diversified into too many product lines with too little differentiation. The company had burned through CEOs. Scully had been pushed out in 1993, replaced by Michael Spindler, who was himself replaced by Gil Amelio in 1996. Each transition had brought new strategies and new urgencies and the same fundamental problem. Apple was not making products that made people feel what they had felt when they first held a Macintosh. The company was losing money. It was losing market share. It was losing, most critically, the sense of mission and identity that had always been its deepest asset. The question being asked, openly and seriously, in the technology press and in the investment community, was whether Apple could survive. Whether the company that had put a dent in the universe had enough left in it to put another one. The answer to that question was approaching. And it was approaching as the most important things in Steve Jobs' life always seemed to, from a direction that no one had quite predicted. Next software needed a larger platform. Apple's computers needed a modern operating system. The conversation that would bring these two needs together was beginning, quietly, at the end of 1996. And the man who had been thrown out of his own house was about to be invited back in. Steve Jobs was 41 years old. He had a great marriage and 3 children and a film studio that had just made history and a software company whose technology was about to become more relevant than anyone outside a small circle of insiders yet understood. The middle of the story was ending. The final act was about to begin. And it would be, by any measure, the most extraordinary act of all. Chapter 9. Return to Apple and Revival, 1996 to 2004. There is an old idea, found in various forms across many of the world's wisdom traditions, that a person must lose something completely before they can truly understand its value. That possession, in the deepest sense, requires first the experience of absence. That the person who returns to something after a long separation sees it with a clarity that the person who never left can never quite achieve. Steve Jobs had been away from Apple for 11 years. 11 years of building in the wilderness. Of learning, at considerable personal cost, the difference between genius and wisdom. Of discovering, through the patient work of 2 companies and a marriage and the arrival of children, something about himself that the frenetic success of Apple's early years had not required him to find. He had left a young man brilliant enough to change the world and not yet mature enough to sustain the change. He was returning as someone different, still brilliant, still driven, still impossible in all the ways he had always been impossible, but carrying now a depth of experience and self-knowledge that would make everything he touched in the years ahead richer and more durable than anything he had built before. The world did not immediately know this. The world, in December of 1996, saw the acquisition of Next by Apple as an interesting corporate transaction. A struggling technology company buying a smaller, equally struggling technology company for its software assets. The price was $429 million, a figure that struck many observers as generous given Next's financial history. What the world did not yet see was that Apple had not simply bought a company. It had bought back its founder. And its founder had come home with everything the exile had given him, ready to do the most important work of his life. The homecoming was not immediate in its fullness. Steve returned to Apple initially as an advisor, a title that carried the deliberate ambiguity of a situation that was still finding its shape. Gil Amelio was still Apple's CEO, a careful and well-intentioned man who had brought Steve back because he understood that Next's operating system was the technical foundation Apple needed, and who had not yet fully reckoned with what else he had invited through the door. Steve moved through the company's corridors in these first months with the particular quality of attention of someone who has been away a long time and is taking inventory. What he saw was not encouraging and not surprising. Apple had expanded into dozens of product lines: printers, cameras, handheld devices, multiple versions of the Macintosh, with the unfocused proliferation of a company that had lost the thread of its own identity. The product matrix was a sprawl. The engineering resources were scattered. The sense of mission that had once made Apple feel, to everyone who worked there, like the most important company in the world, that sense had gone quiet under years of management by people who understood business but did not understand Apple. The company was losing money at a rate that genuinely threatened its survival. The cash reserves were dwindling. The stock price had fallen to levels that made the company a plausible acquisition target. There were serious people making serious arguments that Apple should be sold or broken up, or simply wound down with as much dignity as possible. Steve sat with all of this information and did what Steve always did: he simplified it. He reduced the noise to the signal. And the signal was clear. Apple was dying because it had forgotten what it was for. In July of 1997, the Apple board removed Gil Amelio. Steve Jobs became interim CEO, a title he accepted with the word interim in it because he was not yet certain he wanted the full weight of the role, and because keeping the word there maintained a useful ambiguity about his intentions that gave him room to move. He would keep the interim designation for over 2 years, running the company with complete authority while officially declining its title, until the board and the circumstances made the permanent appointment inevitable and he accepted it. One of his first significant acts as interim CEO was a decision so counterintuitive, so contrary to the competitive instincts that govern Silicon Valley, that it shocked the industry and confused many Apple employees deeply. He called Microsoft. More specifically, he called Bill Gates. And he negotiated a partnership in which Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to producing Microsoft Office for the Macintosh platform for at least 5 more years. The reaction when Steve announced the deal at the 1997 Macworld Expo in Boston was one of the most viscerally uncomfortable moments in Apple's history. The audience booed. The image of Bill Gates, appearing on a giant screen above the stage via satellite link, was met with something close to hostility. For the people in that room, Microsoft was not a partner. Microsoft was the enemy, the company whose Windows operating system had taken the graphical interface that Apple had pioneered and turned it into the dominant standard of the personal computing world. Welcoming Microsoft's investment felt, to many of them, like a surrender. Steve stood on that stage and absorbed the reaction without flinching. He told the audience, with the directness that had always been his most reliable instrument, that the era of thinking about Apple's success as requiring Microsoft's failure was over. That Apple needed to stop fighting old battles and start building new ones. That the company's survival required pragmatism as well as vision, and that anyone who could not make peace with that reality was not truly interested in Apple's future. It was a statement of leadership, delivered in public, under pressure, without apology. The audience settled. The deal stood. And the $150 million bought Apple time it desperately needed for what Steve was about to do. What he was about to do was something so fundamental that it required dismantling almost everything that had accumulated in the years of his absence. He cut the product lines, ruthlessly, without sentiment, from dozens down to 4. 4 products. A professional desktop. A professional laptop. A consumer desktop. A consumer laptop. Everything else was discontinued, regardless of the feelings of the teams that had built it or the customers who had come to rely on it. The people who ran the discontinued product lines were not pleased. Some of them argued strenuously that their products had genuine markets and genuine futures. Steve listened to the arguments with the patience of someone who had already made up his mind and was allowing the process its dignity. Then he cut the products anyway. The simplicity was the point. Not simplicity as aesthetic choice but simplicity as strategic discipline, the recognition that a company with limited resources that tried to be everything to everyone would end up being nothing to no one, while a company that focused its entire force on a small number of things and made those things extraordinary could move mountains. He had learned this at Next. He had watched Pixar practice it. Now he was applying it at a scale that made everything before it look like a rehearsal. The four-product strategy was the skeleton. The flesh that would cover it came from the most talented designer Steve had encountered since Wozniak, a quiet, thoughtful Englishman named Jonathan Ive, who ran Apple's design team and who had spent the years of the company's decline doing work that had gone largely unrecognized because there had been no one in Apple's leadership with the eye to see it. Steve walked into Johnny Ive's design studio shortly after returning and found, spread across the tables and pinned to the walls, a vision of what Apple's products could look like that matched his own imagination so precisely that it was, he said later, like finding a collaborator he had been looking for his entire life. Johnny Ive believed, as Steve believed, that design was not decoration. That the form of an object was not separate from its function but was, in the deepest sense, the same thing expressed differently. That the experience of picking up an object, of holding it and looking at it and living with it, was as important as what the object did. That the outside of the computer was not the wrapper around the real product, it was part of the real product. Together, Steve and Johnny would produce, over the years that followed, a body of work that redefined the visual and physical language of consumer technology. Their first significant collaboration was the product that served notice to the world that Apple was alive again, genuinely, defiantly, magnificently alive. It was called the iMac. The iMac was introduced in August of 1998, and it was unlike anything the computer industry had produced. Its monitor and computer were integrated into a single unit, which was itself not new as the original Macintosh had done the same thing, but its design was something no one had seen before. It was made of translucent colored plastic in a shade of blue-green that Apple called Bondi Blue, and it was curved and friendly and almost organic in its forms, sitting on a desk like an object that had grown there rather than been assembled in a factory. It had a handle. A computer, a desktop computer, a machine that sat on a desk and did not move, had a handle because Steve and Johnny understood that the handle said something to the person looking at it. It said, "You can touch this." It said, "This machine is friendly." It said, "Technology is not something to be afraid of." It was a statement of values expressed through the specific curve of a piece of plastic, and it worked with a completeness that surprised even the people who believed in it. The iMac sold 278,000 units in its first 6 weeks. It was the fastest-selling Macintosh in the company's history. It brought new customers to Apple. People who had never owned a Mac before, people who chose it not because of a technical specification but because of how it made them feel to look at it. People who wanted, perhaps without quite being able to articulate it, a computer that respected them enough to be beautiful. Apple was back. Not all the way back. The work of genuine revival was a multi-year project, not a single product announcement, but back in the sense that mattered first, which was the restoration of the belief inside the company and outside it, that Apple was capable of doing things no one else could do. The years that followed the iMac were years of systematic reconstruction. Steve rebuilt Apple's retail strategy, opening the first Apple stores in 2001, designed with Johnny Ive and a retail specialist named Ron Johnson, spaces that were unlike any electronics store in existence. They were bright and open and organized around the products themselves rather than around price tags and promotional displays. They were, in the tradition of everything Steve had ever made, an argument about what was possible when someone cared enough to think clearly about the experience of the person on the other side. The Apple stores were initially greeted with skepticism by the retail industry, which had seen technology companies try and fail to sell directly to consumers before. The skeptics were wrong with a comprehensiveness that was almost instructive. The Apple stores became, within a few years, the highest-grossing retail spaces per square foot in the world. But the product that changed everything, the product that moved Apple from a remarkable computer company back into a position of genuine cultural centrality, was not a computer at all. It was a music player. The iPod arrived in October of 2001, at a moment when the music industry was in the particular kind of chaos that accompanies a technology transition that the industry itself does not yet understand. Napster had come and gone, but the file sharing it had inaugurated had not, and the recording companies were responding to the digital disruption of their business model with a combination of litigation and denial that was failing on both fronts. People were getting their music digitally. The question was not whether that would happen but how. Steve understood the question better than almost anyone in either the technology industry or the music industry. He understood it because he had always understood music, had loved it since the days of Dylan and the Beatles in his teenage bedroom in Sunnyvale, and because he had the instinct to see, in a moment of industrial confusion, the shape of the solution that was waiting to emerge. The solution required two things: a device and a store. The device would hold music in a form that was beautiful and simple and genuinely pleasurable to use. The store would make it possible to buy individual songs legally, easily, and affordably at a price point, 99 cents per song, that competed effectively with the free alternative without pretending the free alternative did not exist. The device came first. Steve described it, in the understated language of a man who knew exactly what he was saying, as 1,000 songs in your pocket. The iPod was small enough to fit in a palm, and it was white, and it had a scroll wheel that responded to the touch with the satisfying precision of a well-made mechanical object, and it held more music than most people had ever owned in physical form, and it connected to a computer with a simplicity that made the process of loading it with your own library genuinely painless. It was a beautiful object. But more than beautiful, it was right. Right in the way that the best products are right, where every decision that went into it was made by someone who had thought carefully about what the person using it actually needed and then refused to compromise that need for any other consideration. The iTunes Store followed in April of 2003, and the combination of device and store created something that neither could have been alone. An ecosystem, a complete solution to the question of how people would relate to music in the digital age. Steve negotiated personally with the major record labels to license their catalogs for the store, using the combination of charm and relentlessness and genuine vision that was his most powerful instrument in a negotiation room. The record labels were skeptical. They were afraid. They had watched Napster destroy their business model, and they were not eager to hand their catalogs to a technology company they did not fully trust. Steve convinced them. He convinced them because he was genuinely right about what he was proposing, and because he could explain why he was right with a clarity that left very little room for doubt. The iTunes Store launched with 200,000 songs and sold 1 million tracks in its first week. By 2004, the iPod and iTunes together had transformed Apple from a computer company into something broader and harder to categorize. A company that lived at the intersection of technology and culture, that made objects people loved not just used, that had established a relationship with its customers that went beyond the transactional into something more like loyalty or trust, or the particular affection we extend to things that have genuinely improved our lives. The stock price reflected this transformation. Apple, which had been trading in the single digits in the darkest days of the late 1990s, had climbed back into territory that made it one of the more valuable technology companies in the world. The employees who had stayed through the difficult years were being vindicated. The culture that Steve had rebuilt, focused, demanding, creative, insisting on excellence with a persistence that exhausted people and produced extraordinary results, was generating momentum that felt, to everyone inside it, like something historic in the making. Steve was 49 years old. He had rebuilt a company from the edge of bankruptcy into a cultural force. He had launched products that people loved with the kind of personal, emotional attachment that technology products had rarely inspired before. He had done it by applying, with the full force of everything the exile had taught him, the convictions he had carried since his father's garage and his mother's books and the calligraphy class at Reed College and the roads of India. The conviction that beauty was not optional. That simplicity was a form of respect. That the person holding the object deserved to have someone think carefully, completely, uncompromisingly about their experience. But even as these triumphs were accumulating, even as the stock climbed and the stores filled and the white earbuds of the iPod became the most recognizable design object of the early 21st century, there was something else happening. Something private, something that Steve had not yet shared with the world, something that would cast a long and complex shadow over everything that followed. In October of 2003, Steve Jobs had been diagnosed with cancer. It was a rare form of pancreatic cancer, a neuroendocrine tumor which was, doctors told him, among the most treatable forms of the disease. He had options. He had time if he used it. Surgery offered a genuine possibility of cure. Steve, in a decision that troubled and baffled the people who loved him and that he would later deeply regret, initially refused the surgery. For 9 months he tried alternative approaches, dietary interventions, spiritual practices, the application of the same force of will that had built 2 companies and rebuilt a third. He believed, with a conviction that was the same quality of absolute certainty that had served him so magnificently in so many contexts and that failed him here completely, that he could address the illness on his own terms. He could not. By the time he agreed to surgery in July of 2004, the tumor had progressed. The surgery was performed successfully in the immediate sense. The tumor was removed, but the delay had consequences that no one could fully measure and that would reveal themselves, slowly and painfully, in the years ahead. He told very few people about the diagnosis. He told Lorraine, of course, and his closest family. He told a small number of people at Apple whose knowledge of the situation was operationally necessary. But the world did not know. The millions of people who had come to think of Steve Jobs as something close to a permanent fixture of the technology landscape, the symbol of a particular kind of creative vision, did not know that the man at the center of everything was fighting for his life. He had rebuilt Apple. He had changed the music industry. He had more left to do, more than almost anyone around him yet understood, because the next thing he was thinking about was not an evolution of what existed but a transformation of an entire category, a reinvention so complete that the category would never look the same afterward. But first, in the summer of 2004, having kept his diagnosis largely secret and undergone his surgery and begun the long process of recovery, he sat down in front of the graduating class of Stanford University and told them about his life. He told them 3 stories, about connecting the dots, about love and loss, and about death. He told them about Reed College and the calligraphy class. He told them about being fired from Apple. He told them about the cancer with a candor and a lack of self-pity that was coming from a man who had fought so hard and achieved so much, something close to grace. And he ended with the words he had carried since he first read them on the back cover of the Whole Earth catalog as a teenager in California, the words that had traveled with him through the garage and the exile and the return and the diagnosis and everything that had happened in between. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. The crowd rose to its feet. Steve Jobs stood at the podium, thin from his surgery and recovery, and he was smiling. Not the smile of performance. The smile of a person who has said something true. There was still more to build. There was still more to become. And the most astonishing chapter of the work was still ahead. Chapter 10. IRA Innovations and Final Years, 2004 to 2011. There is a kind of person who, when they learn they are mortal, not in the abstract way that all of us know it, but in the immediate, specific, undeniable way that a diagnosis makes real, responds not by slowing down but by accelerating. Not by retreating into safety but by leaning further into the work, the vision, the unfinished business of a life that has always moved toward something just beyond the horizon. Steve Jobs was that kind of person. The surgery of 2004 had not cured him, though it had bought time, and Steve used that time the way he had always used everything available to him, completely, without waste, with the focused intensity of someone who understands that the supply is finite. The years between 2004 and 2011 were, by any honest measure, the most creatively productive of his life. They were the years in which he remade not one industry but 3. They were the years in which the full synthesis of everything he had ever learned, the calligraphy and the Zen, the garage and the exile, the beauty and the stubbornness and the absolute refusal to accept that good enough was ever actually good enough, found its most complete expression. They were also the years in which a man who had always lived at full speed began to reckon, quietly and without much public acknowledgement, with the approaching end. And that reckoning gave everything he made in these years a quality that is difficult to name precisely but that everyone who encountered him in this period felt: a depth, a deliberateness, a sense that each thing he was doing was being done with the full weight of everything he knew and everything he was. He was making his life's work. And he knew it. The first of the great transformations of this final period was the one that changed the way human beings related to their own pockets. The iPhone. The story of the iPhone's creation is, in miniature, the story of Steve Jobs' entire philosophy of making things, beginning with a problem observed clearly, proceeding through an insistence on a solution that did not yet exist, and arriving, after years of secret and often agonizing work, had a product so different from what preceded it that the world it entered was permanently altered. The problem Steve observed in the early 2000s was the mobile phone. Not the mobile phone as a technical object, he was not primarily interested in its components or its radio architecture, but the mobile phone as a human experience. As something you held in your hand and used every day to communicate with the people in the world around you. The mobile phones of the early 2000s were, by that measure, failures. They were cluttered with buttons arranged without apparent logic. Their software was an afterthought, crammed into devices designed primarily as communication hardware, operating through menu structures of Byzantine complexity. They were, in the language Steve used internally when he was being most direct, not good enough. Not close to good enough. He believed, and this belief was the seed of everything that followed, that the computer had taught people to expect something better. That the experience of using a Macintosh or an iPod, or an Apple product of any kind had established a standard of simplicity and rightness that the mobile phone was nowhere near meeting. And that the company that closed that gap, that brought to the phone the same quality of design thinking that Apple had brought to the computer and the music player, would do something genuinely historic. In 2004, Steve initiated a secret project inside Apple. It was called, internally, Project Purple, and it operated with a level of secrecy that went beyond even Apple's characteristically obsessive confidentiality. The engineers and designers working on it signed additional non-disclosure agreements. The floor of the building where the work was happening was secured separately from the rest of the campus. People who worked on Project Purple could not tell their families what they were doing. What they were doing was reinventing the phone. The central insight, the decision that made everything else possible and that required, in its making, a kind of creative courage that is easy to underestimate in retrospect, was the elimination of the physical keyboard. Every smartphone that existed in 2004 had physical buttons. The dominant player in the market, a Canadian company called Research in Motion whose BlackBerry device had become the essential tool of business communication, built its entire identity around its physical keyboard. Conventional wisdom in the industry held that people needed tactile feedback to type accurately and that any device without physical keys would frustrate its users into abandonment. Steve rejected that conventional wisdom completely. Not because he had data that contradicted it, he did not, because the product he was imagining did not yet exist and therefore no data about it could exist. He rejected it because he had the capacity, which was perhaps his rarest gift, to imagine an experience that no one had yet had and to trust that imagination over any amount of evidence drawn from experiences that already existed. A screen, he insisted. The whole front of the device should be a screen. A screen that could be a keyboard when you needed a keyboard and a map when you needed a map and a camera viewfinder when you needed a camera and whatever else the moment required. A screen that would respond to the touch of a finger with a fluidity and precision that made the interaction feel natural. Feel, as much as possible, like touching the things themselves rather than the representations of things. This was the vision. The execution took 3 years of work that was, by the accounts of everyone involved, among the most demanding they had ever done. The technology required to make a touch screen that was accurate enough, responsive enough, durable enough, and manufacturable at scale essentially did not exist when the project started and had to be invented, iterated, and perfected while the rest of the device was simultaneously being designed and built. Steve was involved in every significant decision. He reviewed prototypes with the combination of enthusiasm and ruthlessness that his team had come to expect. Capable of genuine delight at a breakthrough and equally capable of sending months of work back to the beginning because something was not right. Not approximately right. Not right enough given the constraints. Right. He had a particular obsession, in these years of the iPhone's development, with the experience of scrolling through a list. The way the list moved in response to a finger. The way it decelerated when you lifted your finger with the specific physics of inertia, so that it felt not like a digital operation but like a physical one, like spinning a wheel and watching it slow. He spent hours on this. He cared about it with an intensity that some of his engineers found difficult to understand until they saw, in a finished product in the hands of a real person, how much that specific quality of interaction contributed to the sense that the device was alive, was responsive, was an extension of the self rather than a machine being operated at arm's length. The iPhone was announced on January 9, 2007, at the Macworld Conference and Expo in San Francisco. Steve walked onto the stage and told the audience that Apple was going to reinvent the phone. He said it with the straightforwardness of someone who had already done it and was simply reporting a fact. He showed them the device, that smooth, black rectangle of glass and aluminum, so simple in its appearance that it seemed almost to have always existed, waiting to be discovered rather than invented. The audience reacted with the kind of sustained, building excitement that only happens when people recognize in real time that they are watching something historic. The demonstration was everything a Steve Jobs product announcement had always been: theatrical, precise, building from the general to the specific with the narrative structure of a story well told, but it carried something extra, something that went beyond showmanship into genuine revelation. He showed them how the phone unlocked with a swipe, how the icons responded to touch, how scrolling worked, how pinching two fingers together zoomed out of a photograph and spreading them zoomed back in. These interactions seem obvious now, seem like the natural and inevitable language of touchscreen devices, because the iPhone taught them to us. Before January 9, 2007, none of them existed in any product anyone could buy. After that day, every other smartphone in the world would eventually have to learn them or become irrelevant. Research in Motion's co-CEO, when he first saw the iPhone demonstrated, reportedly said that it could not possibly work the way it appeared to work, that it was technically impossible. That was not arrogance speaking. That was genuine disbelief, the reaction of an expert confronted with something that contradicted everything his expertise told him was possible. He was wrong, as experts confronted with genuine innovation sometimes are, and his company paid a price for that wrongness from which it never fully recovered. The iPhone went on sale on June 29, 2007. People lined up outside Apple stores days in advance, not because the device was the only way to make a phone call, but because owning one felt, to the people standing in those lines, like participation in something they did not want to miss. The cultural dimension of an Apple product launch had reached, with the iPhone, a pitch that no technology company had previously achieved and that most would never come close to. Within 3 years, the iPhone had become the most profitable product in the history of consumer electronics. Within 5, it had fundamentally altered the landscape of the global technology industry, rendering entire categories of device obsolete and creating new categories: the app economy, the mobile internet as a primary rather than secondary mode of connectivity, that would generate trillions of dollars of value in the years that followed. Steve was 52 years old when the iPhone launched. He was also, though the world did not know it, sick in ways that were becoming harder to manage and harder to conceal. The cancer had returned, or rather had never fully left, and the treatments he was receiving were taking a toll on a body that the stress and intensity of decades of work had already pressed hard. He was thin in these years, noticeably, increasingly thin, in a way that generated speculation and concern among the people who watched him present and the journalists who covered him and the investors who needed to believe that Apple's extraordinary run was not dependent on the continued health of a single individual. Apple's position on the subject of Steve's health was one of the most controversial aspects of his leadership in these final years. The company disclosed less than many believed it should, and Steve's own instinct toward privacy in matters he considered personal sometimes came into conflict with his obligations as a public company executive. He took a medical leave in January of 2009, his second since the original diagnosis, during which Tim Cook ran Apple's day-to-day operations. He returned in June of that year, visibly recovered and visibly changed. Quieter in some ways, more direct in others, as if the experience had burned away some of the remaining insulation between what he thought and what he said. The third great product transformation of his final years was announced in January of 2010, and it occupied a category that Steve himself described, with characteristic precision, as something that had to be substantially better than a laptop at some things and substantially better than a smartphone at others to deserve to exist at all: the iPad. There had been tablet computers before the iPad. The technology industry had been trying to make them work for years, with results that ranged from mediocre to genuinely poor. The devices were too heavy, or too slow, or too complicated, or simply too compromised in their design to fulfill the promise that the concept held. Steve's version of the tablet resolved those compromises not by finding clever workarounds but by returning, as he always returned, to first principles. What was the thing actually for? Who was going to use it, and in what circumstances, and what did they need it to feel like in their hands? The answers to those questions produced a device that weighed less than it seemed like it should, that responded faster than people expected, and that held itself with the particular rightness of an object that has been thought about completely. The iPad launched in April of 2010 and sold 1 million units in its first month. Within a year it had created an entirely new product category, the consumer tablet, that every major technology company in the world rushed to populate with their own versions, none of which ever quite matched the clarity of the original. By this point, Apple had become the most valuable technology company in the world by market capitalization. It was, in certain periods of 2011, the most valuable company of any kind in the world, more valuable than ExxonMobil, more valuable than any other entity in the global economy. A company that had been within months of bankruptcy in 1997 had, in 14 years under Steve's returning leadership, become the largest company on Earth. The numbers were staggering. But Steve was not thinking about the numbers. He was thinking, in these final months, about the things that had always mattered to him, about the quality of the work, about the products that were still in development, about the people he had built his teams from and the values he had tried to embed in the culture that would outlast him. He knew, by 2010 and into 2011, that it would need to outlast him. The cancer had progressed in ways that treatment could no longer adequately address. He had undergone a liver transplant in 2009, a procedure he managed with the characteristic secrecy that had always been his instinct in matters of personal vulnerability, and the transplant had bought more time. But time was running short in ways that Steve, who had always trusted his own instincts above all other forms of information, could feel. He spent time in these final years with the people he loved. With Laureen, whose patience and steadiness and intelligence had been the anchor of his adult life in ways that he acknowledged more freely now than he once had. With his children, Reed, Aaron, Eve, and Lisa, the daughter whose early years he had missed and with whom he had worked, imperfectly and genuinely, to build something real. He had not been a perfect father. He knew this, said it, and devoted what energy he had to closing the distances that remained. He had long conversations in 2010 and 2011, with a biographer named Walter Isaacson, who was writing the authorized account of his life. The conversations were, by Isaacson's account, remarkably frank. Steve speaking about his failures and his regrets with an honesty that he might not have been capable of in earlier years. The adoption and the complicated feelings it had generated throughout his life. The ways he had treated people badly and the specific instances he wished he could revisit. The cancer diagnosis and the months of refusing surgery and the question of whether that delay had cost him years he could not afford to lose. He talked about design and about simplicity and about the intersection of the liberal arts and technology that had been his deepest conviction since he first understood, as a teenager in Silicon Valley, that the future would be made by people who could think in both languages. He talked about Apple and what he hoped it would remain: focused, demanding, unwilling to make things that were less than excellent, committed to the belief that the people who used its products deserved the same quality of attention that had gone into every product he had ever made. He took a second medical leave in January of 2011. In August of that year he resigned as Apple's CEO, recommending Tim Cook as his successor. In a letter to the board that was brief and direct in the manner of a person who has said everything important in other places and other ways, he wrote simply that he had always said if there ever came a day when he could no longer meet the duties and expectations of Apple's CEO, he would be the first to let them know. That day had come. He remained chairman of the board. He continued to come into the office on the days when he was able. He continued to weigh in on products and decisions with the authority of a person whose opinions carry more weight than their title, which had always, in truth, been the only kind of authority Steve Jobs had ever actually wielded. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died at his home in Palo Alto, California, surrounded by his family. He was 56 years old. The world's response was immediate and personal in a way that the death of a business executive rarely produces. People left flowers and apples and handwritten notes outside Apple stores around the world. They posted on social media with a grief that was genuine and surprised them with its intensity, the grief of people who had not personally known him but who felt, in some real and hard-to-articulate way, that the world had lost something they could not easily replace. A quality of attention. A refusal to accept limitation. A voice that had argued, consistently and beautifully and sometimes infuriatingly, that the things we use every day deserve to be made with love. President Obama issued a statement. Leaders in technology and art and culture offered tributes. But the words that carried the most weight were the simplest ones. The words of ordinary people who picked up their iPhones to read the news of his death and felt, in the object in their hands, the presence of the person who had insisted it be made the way it was made. Steve Jobs had wanted to put a dent in the universe. He had done it. He had done it several times in several different forms, across a life that was by turns visionary and difficult and generous and flawed and irreplaceable. He had started in a garage with a circuit board and a belief that technology could be beautiful. He had ended having given the world the personal computer, the animated feature film, the digital music player, the smartphone, and the tablet. 5 industries transformed, 100 million lives changed in ways both large and small, a standard of creative excellence embedded in the culture of a company and an era. The boy who had taken apart radios in his father's garage, who had slept on dormitory floors and read calligraphy textbooks and traveled the roads of India and painted the back of the fence and stayed hungry and stayed foolish through every triumph and every failure, that boy had become, against all the odds and because of all the odds, exactly who he had always been trying to be. Someone who made things that mattered. Someone who cared enough to get them right. Someone who understood, in the end, that the dent you leave in the universe is made not by the size of what you do but by the quality of the attention you bring to doing it. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. The story is complete. But the work it produced, the objects, the ideas, the standard it set for what human creativity and technological vision can achieve when they meet in a single extraordinary life, that work is still in the world. Still in our pockets. Still on our desks. Still, in the most literal sense, in our hands. And still, every time we use it, asking us whether we are bringing to our own lives the same quality of intention that went into making it. Whether we are hungry enough. Whether we are foolish enough. Whether we dare.